Malfoy's sharp gaze settled on Ron, and he led the taunts with a sneer. "Hurry up and put it in, Weasley." "Just so you all remember," John said flatly, holding the goblet of fire like a scepter. "Putting your name in signs a contract with the goblet. If it chooses you, you'll go, dragon's teeth and all." Ron forced his hand toward the goblet, but his fingers trembled and faltered. He had never imagined this possibility and had no prepared name to slip in. John stood over the Gryffindor table, scanning it like a ruler surveying subjects. Seamus, who had mocked Cedric for being pretty. Dean, who fancied himself a future champion if the age rule were relaxed, both fell silent under John's gaze, shrinking away. John walked along the length of the table with the goblet in his hands. "Put your names in," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Show me the courage you have when you insult someone behind their back." When he reached Harry, John chuckled. "Harry, aren't you going to try?" Harry clenched his fists, emerald eyes locked on John. At that moment, Dumbledore cleared his throat and said with a complicated look, "Put the goblet back." John bowed with a respectful, almost mocking smile. "Of course, I would never go against your wishes." The students parted for him. He walked out past the age line, stood just outside it, then stepped in. Magic brushed his skin. The age barrier had no effect. Expressionless, he crossed the line and set the goblet of fire back on its pedestal himself. His casual breach of Dumbledore's boundary was a slap to the faces of those who had doubted him. It was not that he lacked the power, he simply chose not to use it, except when he wanted to make a point. Malfoy strode out, arms spread theatrically to the great hall, laughing. "Our Slytherin king deigns not to bother with the weak." The Slytherins cheered and laughed. Ron, bloodless, had no stomach to stay and slipped out. Harry and Hermione hurried after him. Hermione remembered John's bearing. He was different now, sharp, unrestrained. He'd just crushed Dumbledore's carefully drawn line without hesitation. John Wick, no longer content to be an NPC in Dumbledore's childish game, had stepped forward on his own terms. Fleur Delacour, in her pale blue Beauxbatons uniform, curtsied slightly as she approached the goblet, wearing the Constellation Society badge. Madame Maxime, who must have seen John's crossing of the line, looked surprised. The Beauxbaton students glanced at John and then filed past the goblet to put in their names. Earlier that day, after teaching Neville some defensive spells in the Shrieking Shack and giving him an unregistered wand so he could practice without fear of detection, John and Neville had left together for the Great Hall. Neville had wanted to ask whether John disliked Harry and his friends. He'd heard rumors of a feud, and he'd hesitated several times until John finally encouraged him to speak. "No, John Sari. Hermione is my friend. This was all Ron Weasley's bluster." Neville exhaled in relief. They reached the Great Hall and separated. At the Slytherin table, a seat was always left empty for John. No one dared sit there. The candles glittered, and the goblet of fire had been brought forward. The students buzzed with expectation. The Weasley twins, minus any silly disguises this time, waited. Everyone would learn the champions' names before the Halloween feast ended. Dumbledore raised his hands. "The goblet is about to make its decision," he announced calmly. "In about a minute, we should know. After the champions' names are called, I would ask them to climb to the top of the Great Hall, walk along the staff table, and enter the room beyond." A minute passed. Dumbledore gave a grand wave of his wand. The candles dimmed to highlight the goblet. Blue-white flames flared, then reddened. Sparks crackled, and a tongue of flame shot upward. A charred scrap of parchment drifted down. Dumbledore caught it and announced, "Victor Krum!" The result was expected. Krum rose with a neutral face and followed procedure into the adjoining room. Applause faded. Another fragment spat out, and Dumbledore read, "Fleur Delacour." Fleur rose, her silvery hair flashing as she glided between the tables and joined Krum. Then, with another blaze, a third scrap fell. "Cedric Diggory!" Dumbledore cried, and the Hufflepuff table erupted. The hall hummed with noise when the goblet flared a fourth time. Sparks flew, a long tongue of flame leapt up, and a fourth paper descended. Dumbledore reached and stared at the name. The room grew still as he cleared his throat and read, "Harry Potter." The announcement stunned everyone. Dumbledore himself looked taken aback and cast an involuntary glance at John. There was no applause. Harry's classmates sat open-mouthed. "I didn't put my name in," Harry managed to say, bewildered, to Ron and Hermione. You know I didn't. Dumbledore, however, called Harry forward before he could explain. Harry rose awkwardly, tripping on his robe, and walked toward the staff table. The Slytherin table erupted in scorn. Look at the chosen one, Malfoy snorted. Told to put his name in and refused, right, only to sneak it in himself. Their laughter cut through the hall. Daphne Greengrass tugged John's sleeve and asked softly, Is it him? John shook his head. He doesn't have that ability. He said it plainly enough that there could be no mistaking his judgment. Harry himself couldn't have cheated. Someone else had put his name in, someone capable of an exceptionally powerful confundus or some similarly potent magic. John thought back briefly to the old rumors about the Chamber of Secrets being opened, an unsettling memory. Amid the clamor, Percy Weasley tried to restore order. John caught his eye and called him over. Percy came, face drawn with the stress of maintaining decorum. John inclined his head and murmured, Tell old Barty that a contest full of surprises makes a better show. Percy blinked at John's casual reference to Barty Crouch Sr., surprised, but there was no time for questions. He gave John a hard look and slipped into the room where the champions had gathered. Inside that chamber, tempers had already flared. Karkaroff and Madame Maxime demanded answers of Dumbledore. The three champions wore different faces, Fleur arrogant, Crumb frowning, Cedric bewildered. Dumbledore stood between Madame Maxime, Karkaroff, Professor McGonagall, and Professor Snape. Old Barty Crouch Sr. was there with a grim expression. Ludo Bagman seemed to relish the drama. Hogwarts has two champions? I don't recall the host school being allowed two, Karkaroff said icily. This is impossible. Madame Maxime agreed, offended. Hogwarts cannot have two champions. It is unjust. Severus Snape's eyes were cold. This is Potter's doing, he spat. Potter has always broken rules ever since he arrived. Thank you, Severus, Dumbledore said sharply, shutting Snape down. He turned to Harry with a calm, searching look. Harry, did you put your name into the Goblet of Fire? No. Harry kept his voice steady despite the dozens of faces watching him. No, I didn't. Did you ask an older student to do it for you? Dumbledore asked. No, Harry snapped. He bristled at the very idea that anyone would suspect him. Madame Maxime raised her voice. Professor McGonagall cut in to defend him. He couldn't have crossed that age line, I believe. Is that so? John Wick went over there? Karkaroff said faintly, and Professor McGonagall had no answer. Dumbledore hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his eyes, then asked, Did you ask John to help you? The room turned colder at the question. Harry felt a dozen stares sharpen into accusation. He straightened his collar, found it hard to breathe, and said, No. They did not believe him. Dumbledore's gaze settled on Snape. Snape considered for a moment, and then said slowly, I don't think John Wick would bother with something like this. That sounded like an absolution. Everyone knew what had happened that morning. Who could say where truth ended and rumor began? Karkaroff, anxiously looking for allies, turned to Crouch and Bagman. You two are our impartial judges, he urged. Surely you agree this is improper? Ludo Bagman dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief and deflected the question to old Barty. Barty Crouch's face was dour as he rose to speak. The door creaked open, and Percy slipped in without ceremony, whispering something in his ear. Barty's expression lightened. We must follow the rules, he said firmly. The regulations are clear. Any name spat out by the Goblet of Fire must take part in the tournament. Karkaroff wanted to protest, but the memory of Azkaban and the man who had sent him there shut his mouth. The humiliation showed on his face. Then put the goblet out again. Let each school pick a second champion, he snapped. The goblet won't light again until the next tournament, Barty replied, impatient. Karkaroff's scowl deepened. He threatened withdrawal, only to be cut off by Moody's entrance. Moody's voice was timbered and unrelenting. This is bound by a magical contract. They must all compete. Moody fixed Karkaroff with a cold stare. This benefits you, doesn't it? Karkaroff tried to look innocent. Moody sneered. Someone put Potter's name in the goblet, knowing full well that if it was chosen, Potter would have no choice but to take part. To do that would require a very clever confundus charm. One Potter certainly isn't capable of, Snape said, but Moody's next remark landed like a stone. Perhaps someone hopes Potter will die in the tournament. Silence fell. The accusation hung in the air. Karkaroff's flustered face betrayed that he understood the implication. The meeting ended sourly. Harry was kept back for questioning, but there were no comforting answers. Later, in the Constellation Society chamber, John had been waiting. Both champions were from the Constellation Society, and he'd opened a bottle of Constellation for them. He made a point of reminding everyone not to overdo it. Fleur looked dejected. Cedric, representing Hogwarts, was embarrassed by the whole business. John let out a dry chuckle. It looks like someone wants Potter in the tournament. Percy arrived last, hovering uncertainly before taking a seat when John nodded. Fleur complained and had drunk too much to be coherent. Heinrich was quiet and dour. John listened as they speculated. No one knew what the first task would be. It was a test of courage and was never revealed beforehand. Champions would face whatever came with only their wands, and only after the first task would they learn of the second. The tournaments were costly in time and danger, but champions were excused from exams and received a tidy purse of galleons. When most had left, John and Percy remained. Percy asked quietly, "Why do you call Mr. Crouch Old Barty? You've guessed already, haven't you?" John leaned back, a faint smile on his face. He placed his hand on the table where a silver mask lay. Percy's breath caught. He laughed awkwardly. "No wonder Mr. Crouch thinks highly of me." "Wrong," John said. "I only gave you a stepping stone. Old Barty values you because he sees your merit." Percy asked, hesitant, "Then, does Mr. Crouch know the rest?" John shook his head. Barty didn't know everything yet. At least, not yet. Percy brightened. He had hoped any favor came from John, but hearing that Barty himself valued him made the future seem promising. John's tone grew serious. "Now is not the time for old Barty to know. Keep it to yourself. The Triwizard Tournament is a springboard, yours as well as his. You've already made a name at the World Cup. This can push you further." Percy promised to do his part. Back at Hogwarts the next morning, everyone had seen Harry's name called. That meant everyone thought he had cheated. Perception mattered more than truth. Even Ron assumed the worst, asked, half joking, if Harry had worn the invisibility cloak to slip his name in. That question stung. Harry and Ron fell into a cold war before breakfast. It seemed to be a pattern. Every school year, this friendship fractured once and then mended. Daphne, who usually ignored Gryffindor squabbles, watched with interest. John, sipping water, called it the law of triangular imbalance, friendships that snap and snap back, as if the conflicts kept them bonded. Hufflepuff was also upset, convinced Harry had stolen Cedric's glory. The tension felt strangely familiar. John remembered similar rivalries from previous years and wondered how they would be resolved this time. Care of magical creatures later that day was another odd scene. John watched a blast-ended Scroot bolt across the field with Malfoy running after it. Someone's finger had been pricked by its spikes, and they yelped. John mused that these creatures needed exercise. Walking them like dogs might expend excess energy. He wondered why Hagrid had never tried that before. Hagrid pulled Harry aside. His usually wild hair looked oddly slick and shiny, as if he'd used some kind of oil. John thought of Lockhart and his miracle shampoos, of how ineffective Lockhart's products were until alchemists improved the formula and rebranded it as Handsome Overlord. The product sold like wildfire, Lockhart the gleaming face of it. Could Lockhart be coaxed into a Triwizard cameo? John's mind wandered until Hagrid, cheeks flushing, stammered a new, more personal question. "John, what do you think would help someone improve their charm?" John raised a hand before Hagrid could over-explain. "A well-groomed beard and neat hair go a long way," he said, and recommended Handsome Overlord. Hagrid blinked, baffled but grateful, and John managed to sell him 5 bottles before Hagrid staggered away, clutching them like talismans. Hagrid then confided that, while Harry had become a champion, the boy didn't seem happy. "Normal," John said casually. "Only the person who's wronged knows how wronged they feel." Then, blunt as ever, "If I had to guess, I'd believe Hermione put the name in at midnight." Hagrid's face registered shock and then bewildered acceptance. John's logic, cruel as it sounded, was plausible. John's Scroot, at his call, stopped its running and came back obediently, which impressed Hagrid no end. On the grounds, a small fashion trend had taken hold. Badges designed and distributed by Draco Malfoy. John suspected this was bitterness masquerading as flair. Malfoy, he thought, had turned to spite because of some imagined romantic slight. The pin was simple. Tap it once, and it read, Red, supporting Cedric. Tap twice, and it flipped to green, reading, Potter stinks. Malfoy tried to hand one to John like a treasure, but John tossed it to Goyle instead. Goyle fumbled it, pleased as could be. The school buzzed with gossip and grievance, masks and badges, and beneath it all, the tournament waited. An engine of fear, opportunity, and cruel spectacle that had already set many wheels in motion. Cedric had always been popular, and becoming a champion only made him more so. A cluster of giggling girls clustered around him, making his embarrassment obvious. Everyone knew he had a thing for Cho Chang. Malfoy had apparently bought a whole batch of novelty badges just to stir trouble. After potions, he stepped forward and deliberately provoked Harry. The badges were already pinned on a lot of students, with only a few around Harry conspicuously badge-free. Like them, Potter, Malfoy called loud enough for half the dungeon to hear. Take a good look, there are other designs too. He jabbed the badge twice. The second press revealed a bright green slogan, Potter stinks. He looked every inch the smug showman, like a petty CEO flaunting his power, delighting in making Harry burn with anger. Hermione put a calming hand on Harry's arm and shot Malfoy a cutting, sarcastic look. Oh, how fascinating. Really impressive. The sarcasm was pure Hermione. Her tone alone might have made Snape sit up straighter. Ron didn't take sides. He stayed with Seamus and Dean, neither stepping forward nor holding back. Malfoy got what he wanted, a fight. Densaujo, Malfoy shouted. Furnunculus, came the counter. The two curses collided in midair, sparing the duelists but bathing bystanders in their effects. Hermione's teeth erupted into ridiculous lengths. Goyle's nose sprouted a grotesque boil. Ron lunged to help Hermione, and Harry spun toward Goyle, only for Malfoy to lunge unexpectedly, grab Harry's collar, and push him hard. Anger took over. Harry swung. Ron joined in. 2 against 1. They didn't get far. Snape arrived, and as usual, whenever Gryffindors lost their heads, promptly docked points. Malfoy strutted back like a victorious rooster, hair mussed but untouched. Ron, however, had taken a genuine hurtful kick and was rolling on the floor in pain. John, watching from the edge of the chaos, nearly spat out his water. Malfoy had been gone only a few hours, and already he'd caused a racket big enough to headline the day. Harry glared at them for the rest of the lesson, like a man who had seen red. John had to admit, Malfoy's talent for attracting dislike was perfectly tuned. He might even earn a higher place on John's own private most loathed list. John conceded he'd never managed that kind of obnoxious skill himself. During the class, Colin Creevey from the year below pushed in asking for an interview with Harry. Snape grit his teeth and told Harry to pack up and get out. As Harry left, he couldn't help glancing at the green badge again, face darkening. John already knew about the interview. Rita Skeeter had written asking how she should cover Harry. John had hoped Rita would bring scandal and sensational copy. The more fireworks around Harry, the hotter the Triwizard Tournament's publicity. He'd even opened a betting pool in the Daily Prophet on which of the 4 champions would win, with high-scoring odds for each event. The whole machine of hype had been primed for weeks. Victor Krum, famous seeker, was the favorite. Harry was a close second, thanks in large part to his being hailed as the savior. If Krum's popularity had been lower, Harry might well have been the outright favorite. Rita, true to form, overdid it. John read that day's Prophet and couldn't help but sigh at her talent for turning little things into headlines. Her piece painted Harry the savior as a pathetic, tearful wreck who sobbed himself awake at night, mourning his parents. For readers who didn't know him, it might have been believable. The image of the holy savior reduced to a sorrowful, pitiable figure was incendiary copy. Even Malfoy, trying to look cool, couldn't resist asking if it was true. John merely rolled his eyes. Didn't you see how he handled himself when you two fought? Rita's spin made Hermione furious. She was already swamped with work, and now the papers were slandering her as Harry's girlfriend. Doesn't anyone know whether she's his girlfriend or not? My concern for Harry is more like maternal affection, you know. Hermione snapped, indignant that affection and concern were being misread as romance. Stuck between calming Harry and dealing with Ron, she had little patience left. John muttered, rubbing his temples. Rita had gone too far this time. Malfoy, hearing the lies were false, immediately doubled down on provocation. Pansy, holding Daphne's hand, read the paper with a sour face and scoffed. Stunningly beautiful? Her? John's attention drifted to another matter, a letter from Tang Mi. A cliff by an orphanage had been located, possibly the hiding place of a Horcrux. After some checking, they had found the cave that matched the memory. It was dangerous, and John planned to investigate with company, not alone. When opportunity came, he intended to go in a group. They decided to go into Hogsmeade. Malfoy, apparently planning to buy more polishing paste for his firebolt, was shoved along by Daphne's dagger eyes. Slipping John's sleeve, Daphne smiled with narrowed eyes. Fancy a drink at the pub? John rarely had time off. When he did, he had good taste. The butterbeer at the Three Broomsticks was excellent. They slipped inside and found a table. John noticed a shelf of novelty drinks and candies, fizzy Whizbees among them, and ordered 2 butterbeers. Soon Ron and other Gryffindors burst in. Looks like this split-up is thorough, John observed, sipping his drink. He reached for a napkin to wipe a ring of foam from Daphne's lip without thinking. She froze, unexpectedly flustered. Hermione? He asked, even though he could see her approaching alone. Hermione slid in, ordered 2 butterbeers, but shoved one discreetly under the table. John watched her closely. There was something different, an invisibility cloak perhaps, but not like Barty Crouch's cheap imitation. This was more complete. You couldn't tell it was there at all. Daphne went a shade of red. John hadn't seen on her before. Outside, Pansy pressed her face to the window, staring in. Draco joined her, dragging Goyle and Crabbe, and the 4 of them squashed against the glass, gossip-hungry and utterly oblivious to the disapproving looks from other patrons. The pub hummed around them. Madame Rosmerta was fussing because Moody had brought his own drink. Moody's magical eye, however, caught John's table and swung to Hermione. Hagrid, sitting nearby, noticed too. He rumbled something under his breath, then got to his feet and waddled toward Hermione's table. John strained to hear. Hagrid, beard trembling with emotion, leaned in and said in a low, clumsy voice, "Harry, come to my hut at midnight tonight. Bring the invisibility cloak." Hagrid's farewell was awkward but sincere. John's mind clicked. Moody's magical eye could see through invisibility cloaks, and Hagrid had just asked Harry to meet him at midnight under cover of one. An invisibility cloak implied secrecy, and when Moody could peer through such concealment, anything arranged under it had to be important. John frowned and muttered to himself, "If Moody can see through cloaks, and Hagrid wants Harry there at midnight, what are they up to?" Chapter 184. The mention piqued John's curiosity, and it seemed Moody had already reminded Hagrid. "I'll go check it out tonight," he said, taking a sip of butterbeer. It tasted like water. It was just getting dark when they returned to Hogwarts. John saw Daphne heading for the kitchens and quickly pulled her back, suggesting she take the day off. Daphne didn't seem to hear him at first. She just stared at the hand he'd grabbed, her cheeks the color of a persimmon. After some coaxing, she finally gave up on cooking for the evening, and John let out a relieved breath. In the great hall, Malfoy was lugging a pile of things like a servant. Even Goyle and Crabbe looked put upon, their arms full. "Shopping is a pleasure," Pansy declared loudly, though she kept winking at Daphne. Today she had indulged herself with Daphne's sweets, and like any best friend, she was more excited to see Daphne happy than if it had happened to her. Malfoy, on the other hand, had been dragged along. He'd intended to humiliate Harry today and had ended up as the baggage mule. There were packages of all sizes, many sweets from Honeydukes, which Pansy generously passed around the Slytherins. She was clearly pleased with herself. John thought their sudden generosity matched. After all, Malfoy had once impulsively handed out free badges to the entire school. They were cut from the same cloth. At midnight, John didn't return to his dorm. He slipped out of the Constellation Society chamber and strolled openly through the corridors after curfew. He encountered Madame Norris and picked her up, petting her a few times before bribing her with 2 small dried fish. Around the next corner, he nearly ran into Filch. They stared at one another. Then, with a tacit understanding, both turned their heads and pretended not to see. To be safe, John cast a disillusionment charm on himself and continued on. Hagrid's hut was unguarded. Beauxbaton's huge carriage sat not far away. John had only been squatting outside the door for a short while when he heard movement. The door opened and Harry stepped out, removing his invisibility cloak. It felt like a secret meeting, clandestine and a little ridiculous. As John started forward, something dashed out of the forbidden forest. Jo Wu, its left eye still blind, the right one partially healed. It scurried around sniffing, then settled and padded toward John, nudging him with a paw as if to confirm he was really there. "Stop it!" John was flicked by Jo Wu's tail and patted its lowered head. "I've got something to do. I'll come see you in the morning." With a bit of mind magic calming it, Jo Wu obediently watched him go, glancing back every few steps with obvious reluctance. A little later, Hagrid came out, improbably dressed up and with his hair combed. Harry followed him. They walked toward the Beauxbaton carriage and knocked. Madame Maxime, also dressed beautifully, opened the door. Hagrid had invited Madame Maxime out. John's expression turned amused. Hagrid on a date? He followed at a discreet distance, genuinely curious. Then he noticed Karkaroff crouched in some bushes nearby. Are all the principals this free, he wondered, one on a date, one hiding in the shrubbery. Would Dumbledore be hiding under the carriage next? As they moved on, raised voices carried through the air, followed by a tremendous, shrill roar. "That's a dragon. Why does that sound familiar?" John quickened his pace and caught up. A group of handlers were working around 4 dragons. They roared and stamped. John remembered Fleur saying the first task tested courage, and what tests courage more than a dragon? His face darkened. "You said the task wouldn't be revealed in advance. Are you all cheating?" Hagrid stood there, dazzled. He'd brought Madame Maxime to look at dragons. John felt sorry for the champions. This was hardly fair. He glanced at the gathered adults. Karkaroff with his usual aloofness, Madame Maxime, Hagrid and Harry. Were they all conspiring to give Cedric an unfair surprise? Cedric felt increasingly like a spare in a field of ripe melons. The dragons roared again, and John recognized one voice, the Hungarian horntail, Amerhem. He'd thought his last encounter with Amerhem ended in that forest. He never expected to find her here, and she wasn't alone. A Welsh green, a Swedish short snout, and a Chinese fireball lay nearby. The handlers had sedated them. Charlie Weasley stood among them, rubbing a hand over his face. "They should be fine," Charlie explained when he saw Hagrid. "We sedated them on the way, thought it'd be kinder to wake them on a quiet night." The 4 dragons sprawled like small mountains. Hagrid watched them with the reverence of a child. "What kind are they?" he asked, practically trembling. Charlie named them, the Hungarian horntail, a common Welsh green, a silver-blue Swedish short snout, and a Chinese fireball. He frowned at Hagrid's companion. "Why did you bring her here? The champions shouldn't know what they're facing." Hagrid, dazzled, said sheepishly, "I just thought she'd like to see them." Charlie sighed. "Romantic date, then." Hagrid tried to focus on the task. "There are 4, right? One for each champion? What do they have to do?" "Get past the dragon," Charlie guessed. He didn't know for sure, only that they were nesting mothers and that the Hungarian horntail was the fiercest he'd ever seen. Hagrid eyed the dragon eggs, covetous. Charlie warned him not to get any ideas. They'd already counted them. Nearby, Harry listened and understood what that meant. He'd be facing a dragon. He felt absurd and suddenly very tense. He had to get back to the common room. Sirius had asked to speak with him tonight. Some things were better discussed in person than by owl. As Hagrid and Charlie talked, John noticed that the Hungarian horntail's eyes were only half closed. The sedatives had dulled her, but not put her out completely. He moved closer, his disillusionment charm keeping him hidden, and whispered in dragon speech, "Amerhem, are you all right?" "Dragon speaker?" Amerhem lifted her head weakly. "How did you get caught?" Her voice was thin with sorrow. "Someone betrayed my location in the forest. A band of wizards ambushed me and took me." She added bitterly, "I was supposed to go to Dead Breath Valley for the trial. Now I can't." John listened. Amerhem had been heading to an ancient rite, a dragon trial in the Dragonland, where dragons earn their names from the dragon elders. Passing could lead to a higher standing, some even becoming dragon royalty. For a dragon to be taken before such a trial was a terrible humiliation. John barely hid his anger at the handler's connections. A soft system-like chime echoed in John's mind, as if the world were annotating the moment. Ding! Challenge quest triggered. Participate in the Dead Breath Valley Dragon Trial. Gain any point. Blessing. Unknown. Unknown blessing? John frowned. The gate of things had been odd before, but an unknown blessing sounded even stranger. Amerham continued. She was, in fact, a female, one of the nesting mothers Charlie had mentioned. Her chance to compete in the inheritance trial and perhaps become the contemporary Dragon King had been stolen from her. Her voice strengthened with the idea. Dragon Speaker, Amerham begs you, help me. Take me to the Dragonland. John hesitated only a moment. He'd been wondering how he might get a dragon to a far-off place, and now a way had presented itself. All right, he said. After the first task is over, I'll get you out of here. Chapter 185. Even now, John didn't dare simply walk away with Amerham, who knew whether Dumbledore or someone else was hiding nearby, waiting for him to slip up. Dragon handlers were all skilled wizards, and to get Amerham out without resorting to lethal force would be difficult. He had barely spoken when the Swedish short snout next door answered in a weak, urgent voice. Dragon Speaker, I beg you. The short snout was barely coherent, but John understood. It was asking for his help. The other two dragons whispered as faintly as mosquitoes, all of them unwilling to return to Romania. All right, John said, but you must obey my orders. Saving one dragon was one thing. Saving four at once called for strict control. He set 3 rules, chief among them that they must never disobey him. If the dragons panicked, things could become disastrous. To his relief, all 4 accepted. Dragons respected a dragon speaker. They had little inclination to resist. Once the agreement was in place, John prepared to leave. He circled where Charlie Weasley had been and headed back toward the castle. On the way, he was detained again by a Zhou Wu. The creature flopped over and rolled about, so John had no choice but to calm it down. After soothing the big cat, he continued toward the castle. He was covered by a disillusionment charm as he made for the dormitory. Normally that would have been enough, but a distant thumping made him frown. Moody. If it had been any other professor, it wouldn't have mattered, but Moody's magical eye had a reputation. It had even seen through Harry's invisibility cloak. John's disillusionment charm was strong, but it couldn't match that miraculous vision. The footsteps quickened. Moody had noticed him. John turned and ran. Moody's eye was extraordinary, but it wasn't fast, and speed was John's specialty. He felt no guilt about outpacing a man whose famed magic couldn't match him. Before Moody could catch up, John slipped into the Slytherin common room. When Moody arrived, he only saw the common room door slowly shutting and stood there a moment, clearly annoyed at having missed his quarry. John didn't actually go back to his dormitory. He waited just inside the common room entrance, a single door between him and Moody. Moody seemed to have been deliberately waiting there. After a while, John convinced himself the man had left. The next day, John arranged to meet Cedric. Has any professor looked for you today? He asked bluntly. Cedric, surprised, shook his head. No, why would a professor be looking for me? John couldn't hide his disdain. If Dumbledore had given orders, why had Harry been tipped off while Cedric, equally a champion, received nothing? John felt more disappointed in the old headmaster than ever. The first task is dragons. John told him. You're probably the only one who doesn't know. He went straight to the point and explained everything he had seen that night. Honest people had a rough time surviving here. If he didn't help a friend, he would be a coward. Cedric was taken aback at the thought of facing a dragon. John offered a small, reassuring smile. Don't worry, I'll help you. There was a dragon speaker in their midst, after all. John felt a little sorry for Fleur, but Cedric had no one. He needed help most. Later, as Cedric headed off to Charms, his bag suddenly ripped open. He told his companion to go on without him and stayed behind to gather his things. Harry took that moment to slide over and whisper, The first task is dragons. Chapter 209, Retrieving the Golden Egg and Ludo's Audacity. What's the best approach to dealing with a dragon? Make the dragon lenient. John wouldn't stoop to such dishonorable tactics. He respected Cedric too much, but making other people's dragons a bit tougher was easy enough. He was surprised Harry had shared the information. I thought he'd keep it to himself, he admitted. Turns out the savior is a man who shares. John wasn't that noble. He hadn't forgotten how the professors favored Harry. Cedric was clearly a champion, yet nobody had looked out for him. Hagrid was simple and hadn't thought to help, but the other professors hadn't even hinted at what the task would be. Even a subtle heads-up would have been something. They considered the problem. Students couldn't defeat dragons, so the task would have to be about stealing something. Charlie had said the dragons brought were nesting mothers. At this stage, dragons guarded their eggs ferociously. John guessed the challenge would involve snatching a dragon egg or something similar. Since it's about taking something, John said, you either make the dragon blind for a time, lure it away, or stop it from moving. Cedric suggested using transfiguration to lure the dragon away. That would take too long, John replied. If you need to take an object, time is the enemy. Luring the dragon away eats precious time. Better to make the dragon stop or speed you up. Maybe you could use a firebolt and summon it with Accio, Cedric said. Cedric was a seeker. Handling a firebolt posed no problem for him, and John was happy to provide one. But Cedric looked troubled. Isn't that cheating? The first task must be done with the wand in hand. It was a fair point. Using Accio to call in a broom from outside felt like bringing a broom in through the back door. Better, John suggested, was to immobilize the dragon. Stunning spells were unreliable. Dragons had thick hides, so it was safer to trap the dragon with terrain or restrain its movement, then use transfiguration to get the item across. They agreed on a plan and began to practice. November 24th arrived. The morning classes finished, and school activities were suspended for the afternoon. The cold made everyone shiver. The Triwizard Tournament, reopened after a century, drew huge attention. Old Barty, now one of the judges, drew extra notice after his strong showing at the previous Quidditch World Cup. The former head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement still looked vigorous enough to work another 100 years. The venue was set in the Forbidden Forest, chosen so rescue could arrive quickly if a dragon accident occurred. John didn't go with Malfoy and the others. Instead, he calmly accepted a ring Tong Mi handed him. He slid it onto his left ring finger, glanced at Jin Ledisley, who had come along, and chuckled. You don't look like a student. Your connection to the Silverhand Flu Network makes things convenient for you. The Silverhand Flu Network ran in all its affiliated shops, including the American branch. My studies are basically finished, Jin said with a pale smile. The school doesn't mind letting me see this legendary tournament. Both Jin and Tang Mi wore white masks of the same style. Tang Mi looked worried. Sir, Moody's magical eye might see through your disguise. No matter. John stroked his face with his right hand, and a silver mask materialized, covering his entire face. This mask has several concealment spells woven into it. The magical eye won't pierce it. Knowing the magical eye had once seen through an invisibility cloak, John had upgraded the mask overnight. It was forged from mithril and layered with concealment charms. Moody's eye was not a problem. Tang Mi relaxed. Silverhand Johnny's shop was sponsoring the event, and their seats were excellent. With a snap, his robes transformed into an emerald green cloak, wrapping him in mystery. Tang Mi and Jin followed close behind. The Forbidden Forest was livelier than usual. A young centaur argued with his parents about whether to go see the dragons. Suddenly, a male centaur stiffened. Bow drawn, he aimed at the uninvited figures who had appeared. Put down your weapons, John said. The deep, hoarse voice made the centaur falter. Beneath the silver mask, his eyes were predators. The little centaur stopped arguing and tucked into his mother's flank, crying. The centaur family could not withstand the pressure and turned to flee. John blinked. Am I that intimidating? Jin grinned. You're known as the second king of the wizarding world. John restrained himself, smoothed his cloak, and walked into the bustling dragon arena. Chapter 186. In the tent set aside for the champions, all four of them looked strained and pale. Knowing what awaited them a full day in advance had done nothing to ease their nerves. They were going to face a dragon, an enormous creature that even many adult wizards would think twice about confronting. The foreknowledge had only stretched out their dread. Fleur's cheeks were washed out, Crumb's expression harder than usual, and Cedric kept pacing and muttering under his breath. Harry felt his own stomach tighten as he stepped in. Only Ludo Bagman, still in his old Wasp's uniform, seemed inappropriately buoyant. He gathered the champions, produced a cloth bag, and had them draw lots. They learned the specifics then, retrieved the golden egg. Cedric's shoulders relaxed at the announcement. It confirmed what he had suspected all along. He smiled for the first time that morning. Fleur drew first and was assigned the Welsh green. She would go second. Crumb drew the Chinese fireball and would go third. Cedric and Harry exchanged a look. Cedric reached in first and came up with the silver-blue Swedish short snout, labeled number 1. Harry's face fell when his turn came. He had drawn the Hungarian horntail, the fiercest of them all, and would enter last. Mr. Diggory goes first. Walk into the arena when you hear the whistle, Bagman announced, glancing at Harry. Harry, a word outside? There was a shrewd glint in Bagman's eyes. From the tone, it was obvious he was offering to fix things. Harry's chest went cold. No, I don't need any help, he stammered. Bagman opened his mouth to press the point, but a low, hoarse voice cut across them. Ludo Bagman, perhaps you've forgotten. You still owe me. The voice was like ice sliding down a spine. Bagman's smile vanished, his face drained of color. Harry looked toward the sound and saw a man wearing a silver mask, the same kind remembered from the Quidditch World Cup, standing beside them. Bagman tried a weak, forced grin. Esteemed Mr. Silverhand, you've got the wrong idea. Wrong? The laugh from behind the mask was dry and dangerous. At the cup, you ran a gambling ring behind my back. When you lost, you borrowed from me. I thought you'd learn your lesson. Bagman began to tremble. The man under the mask stepped closer, and Bagman could see the cold set in the eyes below it. If you try to rig this tournament to take galleons from Silverhand, the man said slowly, then you will find what grows in the soil of Nocturne Alley is not to your liking. Bagman made frantic promises of fair play and dragged Harry back into the tent. Harry's heart thudded in his throat. His nerves were raw. After the warning, the silver-masked man, John, took his seat among the judges. Some glances in the crowd lingered on him, but he showed no expression. Tang Mi leaned over to John and said, Bagman's placed a huge sum on Harry Potter winning. He must be trying to pay off his debts through the betting. John only nodded once. Bagman had indeed run up debts at the World Cup. If he didn't find a way to recoup them, he might have to flee the country. Rigging the tournament to win bets was the sort of desperate scheme that courted disaster. When the first whistle blew, Cedric walked into the arena. The Swedish short snout fixed him with an angry, maternal glare. Facing a dragon without showing fear already said something about Cedric's nerve. He tightened his grip on his wand and put his plan into motion. He pointed and cried, De Primo. The earth under the dragon's feet shifted. He cast the spell again. De Primo. The ground loosened in a widening ring. Then Cedric brought his wand to his lips and blew. A pale mist shivered from the tip and billowed toward the dragon. The judges murmured. A new charm, Dumbledore commented, surprised. I've not seen that before. The short-snouted dragon snorted and refused to back down. It opened its jaws and breathed a gout of fire. The flames ignited with a strange cold white flare inside the mist. The dragon egg stirred. As the creature's attention snapped toward the mist, a figure seemed to dart away, clutching the egg, an illusion conjured by Cedric. Enraged, the dragon charged after it, and in doing so stepped into the loosened earth. The soil collapsed, and the dragon's legs sank and became trapped. It roared and belched fire, but it could not pursue further. Bagman's voice rose, breathless with excitement. For a moment it seemed every heart in the tent stood still, until they realized the figure hit by the dragonfire had been a phantasm. The real Cedric had crested a nearby mound and was holding the golden egg aloft in one hand while standing unharmed. He got the egg, Bagman shouted, suddenly full of stadium showman enthusiasm. Effortlessly, we must reassess this champion. 6th year Hogwarts. Excellent performance. The judges moved to score. Madame Maxime's wand flicked and a silver ribbon formed, curling into a confident 9. Barty Crouch Sr. raised his wand and sent out a perfect 10. Dumbledore, smiling faintly, offered a 9. Bagman's face twisted as he hesitated and then sent an 8. All eyes turned to Karkaroff. He stood impassive for a beat and then his wand produced a glaring 4. The crowd erupted. Conspiracy, someone shouted. The single shout spread like a flame. Voices piled on, Conspiracy! And the murmur became a roar. Karkaroff's face sank. Even he could feel the tide of opinion turning against him. People began to call worse things, and someone even yelled, "Death Eater." Karkaroff broke into a cold sweat. He blinked, then raised his wand again. With a grudging, forced motion, he altered the score to a 7, his reluctant concession to the mounting pressure. He glared in the direction of the shout but could not spot who had cried it. The crowd's displeasure did its work. Cedric bowed to the audience as he left the arena, earning genuine applause. Fleur went next. She used a powerful charm, likely from Madame Maxime's coaching, that almost lulled her Welsh green to sleep. Her method took time. She needed nearly 10 minutes to fetch the egg, and her score fell slightly short of Cedric's. Crumb took the field third, face set like stone. John, remembering Karkaroff's earlier behavior, allowed himself a small, private smile. The Chinese fireball, however, was not content to be subdued. With a low, angry roar, it spat a barrage of fireballs and, in a shocking move, actually took to the air. High-temperature flames slammed into the ground around Crumb, giving him no clear opening to cast. One fireball arced dangerously close to the judge's stand. The spray of flaming embers caught Karkaroff's robes, setting them alight and sending him leaping up to pat desperately at the flames. Chapter 187. Crumb wanted to get to the dragon egg, but the Chinese fireball acted like it had eyes on its back. It blasted a gout of flame near the egg, and then spat a series of fireballs that formed a blazing cage around it, making any approach impossible. Forced to fight, Crumb drew on the full measure of his strength. Chosen as a Triwizard champion, he was no pushover. Finding a narrow opening in the dragon's pattern with the keen vision of a seeker, Crumb cast a conjunctivitis curse that temporarily blinded the beast. He risked everything and plunged through the flames, snatching the golden egg. It took him 28 minutes, the longest time of all. After the curse, the Chinese fireball went into a wild frenzy of fire, and the crowd scattered as the dragon spit indiscriminately. The handlers eventually subdued it with stunning spells. Crumb emerged with his robes singed and patches of hair burned away, a messy performance that should have cost him points. Yet Karkaroff, in his notorious magnanimity, still awarded him a 10. John couldn't help but admire the man's audacity, silent praise of brazen favoritism. Harry was the last to go. He had seen Crumb's ordeal and turned pale as he stepped out. As the final contestant, he drew the most attention, and he had to face the savage Hungarian horntail. Even the handlers hovered nervously at the edge of the field. Harry steadied himself on Moody's advice, use your strengths, and on the fact that he had learned Accio overnight. He pictured the one thing he wanted and raised his wand. Firebolt! Accio! The broom rocketed into the enclosure at breathtaking speed and came to a sudden halt by Harry's feet. He swung a leg over without hesitation. His confidence returned in a flash. He just had to fly, and fly as fast as possible. Bagman's voice rose excitedly from the stands. "Oh my goodness, he can fly!" John, watching, thought wryly that if a broomstick couldn't fly, it would hardly be called a broomstick. The crowd screamed as if they could already see Harry teasing the dragon. Then a winged claw filled his vision, and Harry was sent flying like a shot. Silence fell over the audience. Amerham let out a roar, and John found himself speechless. This dragon felt different, fiercer than the earlier Chinese fireball. It didn't glance at the egg at all. Its great yellow eyes shone with an almost feral delight. This wasn't just any dragon. Amerham had a reputation from Dead Breath Valley, an emblem of pride and strength. One wing beat nearly knocked Harry unconscious, though the creature seemed to restrain itself enough to avoid a fatal blow. By the time Harry steadied himself, Amerham was looming close and ready to strike. Harry turned and climbed, but the horntail was shockingly fast. It chased and clawed at him through a gale whipped up by its own wings. "What?" Harry cried as he pushed the firebolt harder. Amerham closed the gap and attacked again. Harry barely evaded and tucked his head to accelerate. Charlie Weasley shouted from the crowd, "Harry, get the egg!" The wind made the firebolt skittish, but Harry's natural talent kept the broom under control. He turned back toward the egg. He couldn't bring Amerham down, so he would win this task by grabbing the prize. Amerham had a weakness. It didn't do well at low altitude. Seizing the moment before the dragon could sweep him off his broom, Harry dipped close, snatched the golden egg, and ended the task. Charlie and the handlers subdued Amerham. The dragon had actually planned to fly off, but remembering some promise John had made, it landed obediently as if the ferocious beast of a moment ago had never been there. Harry was battered but finished in 7 minutes, only slightly slower than Cedric. Had Amerham not been so aggressive, he might have been faster. As always, his talent shone through. The judges scored him. Madame Maxime gave him an 8, Old Barty a 9, Dumbledore a 9, Bagman a 10, and Karkaroff a 6. That left Harry in second place, with Cedric first, Fleur third, and Krum fourth. Chapter 211, Excluding Neville and the Dragon Shadow Scare. The first task was over, and the second would take place on the morning of February 24th. In the Constellation Society chamber, 2 golden eggs sat on the table. 8 people gathered around them, eager to find the promised clue. Mr. Bagman said the clue for the second task is hidden inside the egg, Cedric said softly. I opened mine, Fleur added, and the sound inside was suffocating. At the mention, Malfoy, unable to resist, reached out and touched one of the eggs. A piercing shriek made him jerk his hand away and slam the egg shut. The others glared murderous looks at him. He offered an embarrassed smile. I was curious, he mumbled. You're not a cat. Where do you get such curiosity? John said with a glance, then picked up his egg. He already had a rough idea what was inside, but kept his expression light. For the sake of fairness, he told the eager faces around him, you'll have to find your own clues. Please, John, Malfoy whined. Of course he wanted to be told. John would have revealed it if only one person's interests were at stake, but here 2 champions were involved. He wanted them to compete on equal footing. Fleur smiled knowingly and shot a challenging look at Cedric. We'll see who is superior, she said. With pleasure, Cedric replied, all sportsmanship. They put the eggs aside and moved on to other conversation. Percy noted that the Triwizard Tournament had drawn wide attention across the wizarding world and reported a few minor incidents during the past weeks, one involving someone impersonating Mr. Malfoy and swindling a bottle of rare wine. Malfoy confirmed it had been a bottle his father prized. Lucius had been furious when it was intercepted, and a polyjuice potion impersonation at Silver Hand Cellar was suspected. It made a small stir before fading. The missing ministry official still hadn't been found, though a map marked with Albania suggested he might have gone there. Old Barty relaxed with 2 glasses of mead. The gathering was amiable. Neville, however, left early to keep an engagement. When he was gone, John tapped his cup to get everyone's attention and said something that immediately turned the mood serious. We need to do something big for Neville, he announced. Something to do with his parents. Golly, I want everyone to take part. The chamber grew solemn. Then John dropped a startling line. I want to exclude him, to bully him, to isolate him, to make him hate me. John, are you mad? Malfoy blurted, then grinned meaningfully. You might have had too much to drink. I haven't had too much, John said, but there was no humor in his voice. Silence pressed in. Cedric, startled, asked simply, why? John's answer was blunt and heavy. Remember Neville's parents? He looked around at each face. I've found a way to cure them, but it requires Neville's personal involvement. To get him to engage in what is necessary, I need him to be driven by hatred. Hatred? Malfoy echoed, immediately thinking of John's earlier emotional exercises. Do you mean, like you're training with me? Something like that, John admitted. But Neville is calmer than you, Draco. I need not just you all, others too, to help push him into a state of isolation, to make him either explode or break in silence. His tone chilled the room. The idea of deliberately pushing someone into an emotional abyss unsettled everyone. Daphne sprang to her feet, horrified. You can't do that. Neville will hate you. He'll want to kill you. Cedric frowned deeply. John, you say this is for Neville's good, but it will ruin your relationship with him. It doesn't matter, John said quietly. What are friends for if not to help when needed? If I were in danger, Cedric, you'd come to my aid, even at cost, wouldn't you? Cedric fell silent, unable to deny the truth in John's words. Percy hesitated, then said at last, the price is too high. He'll understand, John insisted, resolute as ever. One by one, the others struggled with the moral dilemma. Heinrich, who had never doubted John, said quietly, I will protect you. No need, John waved him off and gave Heinrich instructions instead. Stay with Fleur during this time. I suspect there may be unforeseen changes in this tournament. Changes? What do you mean? Percy pressed. Harry's inclusion wasn't an accident, John said gravely. Someone manipulated the Goblet of Fire. Whoever is behind this has designs on the tournament. We have to be ready. He had not yet met this person, but John was certain of their capability. The tournament had implications beyond sport. It was political, a stage for the ministry's future. John wanted to plan ahead. Once Old Barty became minister, positions and influence would be reshuffled. Percy, considering career prospects, listened closely. The others agreed to stay vigilant. Only Daphne remained openly furious. After that heated exchange, they left the Constellation Society chamber, each thinking about the troubling plan John had proposed. Chapter 188. John watched from the shadows as a team carrying 4 massive iron cages left Hogwarts. His pupils narrowed until they were vertical slits. His sight sharpened, and everything grew larger and more detailed. He could clearly see the dragon hands' faces, alert and cautious. "Wait until we're a good distance away before making a move," one of them warned. John slipped deeper into the darkness and vanished. Charlie Weasley yawned. The freckled dragon hand grumbled, "They don't even let us have a night's rest. They're too impatient." "It's better to be careful," the older handler replied. "These are dragons. If something happens on school grounds, it would be a disaster." "How can you sleep at your age?" the younger man scoffed. "When I was your age, I was already out on my own subduing rampaging dragons," the older man shot back. The freckled handler shut up, though he rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath, "If you were that amazing, you'd be Minister of Magic." Charlie laughed. He loved working with dragons. It never felt like drudgery to him. He'd had a chance to join a professional Quidditch team once, but the draw of dragons had won out. The group entered the Forbidden Forest. After some walking, the usual forest sounds dropped away until the place was unnaturally quiet. Charlie's instincts prickled. He stopped and listened. The others exchanged puzzled looks. Charlie's face, however, had gone serious. The older dragon hand nodded and said, "It's too quiet." The forest was full of magical creatures. How could it be so still, with not even insects or birds making a sound? Then a faint whirring reached their ears. The clouds parted and a moonbeam cut through the trees. Charlie looked down and a chill ran through him. A vast dark shadow lay over them, casting a menacing silhouette. "Alert!" he shouted. A pair of terrible brown eyes opened in the blackness. Before the freckled handler could react, a tail whipped through the air like a striking basilisk and sent him sprawling. The older handler barely had time to draw his wand when a hurricane-force wind swirled around him, ripping his wig from his head. A red glow flared within the shadow. Charlie yelled. He rolled and fired a stunning spell. The faint red light didn't seem much, but it reminded the others they were still wizards. They reacted, launching stunning spells at the looming shape. The beast's breath cut through the spells. Sheets of crimson flame licked over their heads and hit the cages. The dragon's horde cages, designed to hold dragons, melted like wax under the heat. A deafening roar ripped through the forest. Amerham smashed out of her cage, beating her wings and spraying dragonfire across the ground. The black shadow didn't pause. It opened its mouth and unleashed flame that liquefied the remaining cages. 3 other dragons roared, freed and furious. Their imprisonment turned into unleashed rage. The dragon hands stood no chance against the 4 dragons, especially with the unfamiliar giant beside them. Charlie had never imagined death could feel so near. Even where the flame did not strike, the residual heat sapped the life from the earth. The huge black dragon's claws tore open the roof of the carriage and exposed the dragon eggs inside. "Of course, eggs," it rumbled. Finding the eggs, the dark dragon wasted no time. It seized the carriage, beat its wings, and issued a roar that shook the trees. The other dragons stopped their attacks and rose into the night, following the dark dragon as it flew away. The older handler coughed up blood. His arm had been burned, though not fatally. He looked shaken. What on earth was that? Charlie's voice was rough. A dragon, a kind I've never seen. They had no way of retrieving the dragons. Several handlers were hurt, but no one had died. By dawn, the wizarding world buzzed with the story. A giant dragon none of them had seen before, impervious to a dozen stunning spells, stealing other dragons away. Some called it the Abyss, its body as black as bottomless night, except for those 2 brown eyes. Chapter 212, The Scent of Wine and a Coquettish Big Cat. The Ministry of Magic reminds Hogsmeade wizards to beware of dragons appearing suddenly in the area. So far, 5 dragons remain unaccounted for, Malfoy read aloud from the Daily Prophet in the Great Hall. Dragons? Daphne said, incredulous. Are those the ones from the Triwizard Tournament? News of yesterday's carnage had spread fast. The dragons had displayed terrifying power. Even the so-called savior had been struck by one. That danger cleared all suspicions of cheating around Harry. Everyone agreed only a madman would do something so reckless. Nobody wore the badges Malfoy had been handing out anymore, and those who did only meant to support Cedric. The green side had fallen out of favor. Malfoy caught Neville approaching the table. Neville asked, bewildered, "Where's John? Why isn't he here today?" Daphne, casually spreading jam on her bread, watched. Malfoy sneered, "Oh, look, it's Neville, celebrating Gryffindor. Must be nice for you." Malfoy's sudden turn left Neville flustered and looking for support. Heinrich walked by and, with a frown and cold tone, told Neville to go away, in words loud enough to draw stares from others finishing breakfast. Neville froze, uncertain what he'd done. "Go back to your seat, Longbottom," Malfoy added scornfully. "You don't belong here." Neville could barely speak. He assumed his absence the previous day had upset them. He trudged back toward the Gryffindor table, more dejected than ever. Cedric, who had once been kind and friendly, brushed past him as if leaving a foul smell behind and walked off. Neville's disappointment deepened. "By the way, Neville," came Cedric's voice from behind. Neville looked up, only to hear a cold, parting remark. "John said you'd do well to know your place. Understand?" Cedric left then. Heinrich and Malfoy exchanged looks as they approached Cedric first when he arrived. Neville felt like he no longer fit in with the Constellation Society. He'd been pushed out by small cruelties. After John rescued Amerham and the other dragons, he'd relocated them to the Forbidden Forest, somewhere no one would find them, a unicorn habitat. He'd bribed the unicorns with a few bottles of Constellation to allow the dragons to wait there undisturbed. He planned to try for Dead Breath Valley trials next year. For now, the dragons would bide their time. A few eggs looked ready to hatch, and the adult dragons, overflowing with maternal protectiveness, didn't mind waiting. John himself, however, had been struck by too many stunning spells and had overslept. In his dragon form, his scales carried some magic resistance, but even so, a dozen stunning spells had nearly put him under. He also noticed his dragon form had grown larger. His transformed state seemed to scale with his magic. When he finally woke, he'd already missed breakfast. His eyes were bleary, and he moved like someone half asleep. People watched him descend the stairs, worried he would topple. Seeing Hogwarts' top student look so exhausted surprised many. Rumors flew. Maybe John had done something enormous. Perhaps he'd gone after the missing dragons alone, or he'd stumbled onto a plot and fought his way through. Whatever the explanation, people were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt because of the reputation he'd built over 4 years. That tiredness lasted the whole day. Even Malfoy could tell John was worn out. "John, what did you do last night?" he asked. "Leave me alone," John muttered, eating with his eyes half closed. Daphne's face softened. She moved to offer him food. Heinrich, ever smooth, cut the pieces into small bites and fed them to John so precisely he could swallow in one go. Daphne bristled, ready to toss her plate in anger at Heinrich's slight. He didn't seem to notice. After dinner, John didn't go to training. He went to bed and slept hard. When he woke the next day, he still looked as if he hadn't fully woken up. That lethargy lingered until Friday, when a dark-faced Professor Snape fixed John with a glare that might have pushed his head into a cauldron to sober him. Yet even half asleep, John could process potion ingredients and brew with unerring accuracy, enough to force an exasperated Snape to grudgingly award points. "Slytherin, 20 points, Snape muttered, irked that he had to give credit to someone practically asleep. Relieved of the small victory, Snape moved on, immediately turning his displeasure toward Neville, already downcast from being shunned. Walking groggy through a corridor, John smelled the faint scent of wine. The aroma tugged at him. He followed it, staggering a bit, and finally stopped in a shadowed corner. He blinked, dazed, looking around as though unsure where he was. Chapter 189, The smell of alcohol hung in the corridor. John nearly collided with someone. His face came up against a scarred man's. "Wick, what are you doing here?" Moody grunted. John stepped back and put on an apologetic smile. "Sorry, I think I took a wrong turn." He bowed slightly, neither cold nor familiar, then turned down another passage. Moody muttered something and limped off on his wooden leg. John hadn't visited Joe Wu in days. During the Triwizard Tournament, Hagrid had hidden it in Aragog's old cave. Now Joe Wu was deliriously happy to be out. Its thick tail fanned like a blooming peony, sweeping back and forth. John stroked its head and felt its joy. Joe Wu rolled over, eyes pleading for more attention. Then it sniffed the air suspiciously and circled him twice. "A student should smell faintly of dragon, shouldn't he?" John said, keeping his expression neutral. Joe Wu, of course, had no idea why a pupil would be associated with a dragon. John liked Joe Wu, so feline, so fluffy, even fond of cat wands. He unwrapped the gift he'd brought and dispelled the shrinking charm. A fluffy ball appeared. Joe Wu's whole body lit up. John levitated the toy and Joe Wu pounced, batting it with enormous paws. Each roll sent the creature deeper into delight until it was wholly absorbed in chasing the furball, ignoring John entirely. It was worth making this, John said with a smile. The toy had to withstand Joe Wu's claws. The materials cost a small fortune, and John had to weave protective magic into it. After a while, he prepared to leave. A cold wind cut his cheeks. Near Hagrid's hut, he found Hagrid pouring pure malt whiskey into the Thestral's troughs. The alcohol stung the air. Some young wizards with low tolerance flushed as they passed by. John wondered who was footing that tab. Hogwarts didn't charge tuition. Its funds came from ministry allocations, the Founders Foundation, alumni donations, and various sponsors. John was one of those donors. Watching possible galleons of his being poured into Thestrals' mouths pricked him, just for a few seconds. Then he shrugged it off. He'd earn it back. Chapter 213, Dobby's Job and the Exploding Crystal Ball. The Hogwarts kitchens employed 100 house elves. Late-night snacks were easy to find. John rarely went below stairs after his third year, but tonight he had a whim. He tickled the pair in the painting. It giggled and became a green doorknob. He opened the door and slipped inside, hearing a high-pitched scream. "Get out, you disgrace to our kind!" An elderly house elf pointed angrily at a familiar face, Dobby. A cluster of house elves crowded around, all showing contempt. Beside Dobby stood another recognizable figure, Winky from the Crouch household. John frowned. Why were these two here? The kitchen chorus continued its tirade. Dobby was a traitor for taking pay from wizards, filthy for wanting wages. Dobby seemed used to the abuse. Winky did not. She cried loudly, her sobs rising into a desperate wail. When the house elves quieted at John's arrival, Dobby rushed over, waving his arms. Dobby knew he would meet John Wick again, he cried. The others kept their noses in the air, unwilling to be associated with Dobby. "When did you come, Dobby?" someone asked. "Today, sir." Dobby came to work today. The pay is 1 galleon a week and 1 day off a month. Professor Dumbledore had said he'd give 10 galleons a week, and Dobby bargained for this price. Dobby sounded as if taking money might earn him pain. The surrounding house elves hissed and muttered. 1 galleon and a day off were scandalous in their eyes. It inverted their sense of duty. Still, Dumbledore had spoken, so they had to accept the outcast. John hadn't expected to run into Dobby. Winky's crying redoubled. John tried to change the subject. "How much did Winky get?" he asked. Winky's sobs flooded louder, tears like a broken dam. "Winky was thrown out. Winky hasn't fallen that far yet," she wailed. An old house elf named Puffy proudly pointed out a spotless workstation. Serving a particular wizard was an honor, and the others looked jealous. John walked past racks of knives, from tiny paring blades to heavy cleavers, kept immaculate and razor-sharp. Shelves held fresh fruit, magically preserved meats, jars of flowers, grains, and nuts. The market condensed into one room. He spotted a small notebook of Daphne's cooking notes and almost opened it, but he stopped. Friends deserved privacy. Before he left, every house elf bowed him out as if sending him off on a long journey. A week after the first task, lessons and routine pulled everyone back to reality. Students no longer taunted Filch as if he were a dragon. Filch had trained himself into surprising shape after last year's humiliation. Where climbing 3 flights once left him breathless, he now strode up 8. John had congratulated him with weighted steel blocks and a pair of acceleration shoes, which pleased Filch immensely. That night, he caught 3 students out after hours. One Gryffindor was dragged away from the corridor just outside the common room. Even the twins, famously bold, now thought twice about roaming. Another day improving Hogwarts' learning environment, John said, satisfied. In divination, it hardly mattered whether John sat in the room. Professor Trelawney treated him the same as always. Staring into the crystal ball, faint shapes formed in the mist. Trelawney's voice went thin and trembling as she spoke. That is a black expanse, death submerged below. They crave to drag life into it. Water is life, and also a poisonous draught. Once taken, it cannot be stopped until it runs dry. The champion's choice, bloodlines shed by bloodlines, death blooming in the night, inextinguishable flames taking the beloved. A gray-white film crept over John's eyes, making them look distant and eerie. Trelawney drifted over, hushed the others, and whispered, "Dear?" For a moment his gaze was terrible and strange. When that pall slid away, an odd, prickling discomfort stayed in his head. Lavender, voice shaking, blurted, "John's starting his death prophecies again." John breathed deeply and forced the feeling down. The crystal ball cracked, then burst. The sound startled even Trelawney. She clutched at her chest. The whole class felt the moment as ominous. Harry and Ron, newly reconciled, stared at John with a mixture of surprise and unease. Professor Trelawney peered at him with concern when John slid into the classroom with a forced, awkward smile. "Sorry, Professor, I need to be excused." It was barely half an hour into class. Trelawney approved his request and, with a grave gesture, amended her earlier prediction, adding 30 points to it for emphasis. John left with a grim expression. The prediction had left him with a very bad feeling. He wondered if whatever it foretold was close by. He walked to the black lake to steady himself and stared into the dark water, a strange cold dread settling over him. "It'll be fine," he told himself. "If everyone's properly equipped, we'll be able to handle whatever comes." He flicked a stone at the lake and hit a merperson who had just surfaced. The creature spluttered a curse and sank back under the waves. John gave it a hard look. The merperson muttered and dove away at once. By the time John returned to the castle, the latest version of Trelawney's prophecy had already spread. This one was even more direct than the obscure pronouncements of his 3rd year. The champion's choice, let the bloodline fight, death blossoms in the night, an unquenchable flame takes away the beloved. Ernie Macmillan swallowed visibly. "This means the champion will die," he said nervously. Hannah Abbott covered her mouth, pale with shock. "Which champion?" Ernie began to point toward Harry before he saw Harry walking by and stopped, embarrassed. John felt a measure of relief and headed for the Great Hall. He spotted Malfoy nearby, chatting animatedly, and went over to intensify his training routine. If anything, Malfoy struck him as the likeliest to run into trouble. He attracted hatred as if by habit. Trouble could find him just walking down a corridor. Later, Fleur found herself distressed. Champions wandering the castle, clutching golden eggs, had become a common sight. Fleur knew John could solve the mystery of the eggs, but out of fairness to Cedric, she insisted on searching alone. She tried a variety of approaches, but Cedric's familiarity with Hogwarts had helped him discover the secret sooner. As a prefect, he had access to the prefect's bathroom, and one day in the tub, he accidentally dropped the golden egg. Diving for it, he heard the muffled song coming from inside the shell. "Seek us where our voices sound. We cannot sing upon the ground. As you search, consider with care. We have taken what you hold most dear. You have but an hour to find it. After an hour, hope is lost. It will vanish entirely, never to reappear." Cedric surfaced sputtering bubbles, stunned. "Is this the clue for the second task?" he wondered aloud. He hesitated about telling the others. "Harry told me about the first task," he said to himself, "and though I knew then, I can't ignore Harry's kindness." He also thought of Fleur. Both were members of the Constellation Society and friends. He felt duty-bound to be on her side. He decided to ask John for advice. John caught on quickly, idly twirling the ring on his finger. "Cedric, you're noble to want to tell them, but don't rush," he said with a small smile. "Let them discover it for themselves if you can. Fleur is proud. She might figure it out in a few days." Convinced by John's calm counsel, Cedric kept the secret. Time at Hogwarts rushed past. 7 days into December, rain, sleet, and gale had the ancient castle shuddering. In the pumpkin patch for care of magical creatures, students shivered. Hagrid had been preoccupied caring for a dozen thestrals and had paid less attention to the blast-ended Scroots. The Scroots, fighting among themselves, had dwindled to 10. They showed no sign of winter hibernation. Their thick shells preserved heat, and the liquid in their tails acted as an igniter. John stared at them, thinking that if he could extract that liquid, perhaps he could concoct a powerful blasting curse. A beetle flew and landed on the fence. The more John looked, the more familiar the insect seemed. His insight flared. The beetle radiated magic. Rita Skeeter. Her recent series of articles about the Savior had been sensational. To find a bigger scoop, she'd brazenly returned to Hogwarts in defiance of Dumbledore's ban. "How did I not realize she was this bold?" John muttered. He watched Rita flit behind Hagrid's hut. A woman in a magenta robe emerged a moment later, crocodile skin handbag dangling, greed written plain on her face. Hagrid noticed her too and blinked, puzzled. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Rita Skeeter. I'm a reporter for the Daily Prophet." Rita plastered on what she thought was a flirtatious wink when she saw John. His eyes, dark and intense, put the smile to flight. The sight of that masked pressure in his gaze made something flash in Rita's mind, an image of a silver mask, and she hurried away like a woman spooked. John watched her go coolly. He didn't trust Rita. A Friday interview with Hagrid would be a trap. He couldn't let Hagrid be fooled, so he delegated the job to Tang Mi. Tang Mi didn't need to confront Rita directly. He merely had someone drop a rumor that when Hagrid had once been imprisoned at the Ministry, a Mr. Silverhand had paid a large sum to secure his release. The hint was enough to unnerve Rita, who had been preparing an exposé. When she learned someone powerful had publicly supported Hagrid, she wilted. The Triwizard's second task required champions to retrieve something from beneath the lake and return it within an hour. The big practical problem was staying underwater that long. John saw Cedric climb out of the Black Lake with a clear bubble enclosing his head. A bubblehead charm, simple, elegant. Cedric smiled. "I'm not quite fluent with it yet. I need more practice." Malfoy, meanwhile, wasn't running laps. John had sent him to provoke Neville. Malfoy's assignment in their crude division of labor was to create hatred and discord. Malfoy was good at bullying. He stood by the lake, hair mussed, looking battered. "John, that's enough," he said, wincing. The red and blue bruises on his lips made him wince. "Neville's come unhinged lately. I said 2 words and he punched me." "You didn't hit back?" John asked. "For sure I did," Malfoy said, looking guilty. "I matched him." John gave him a skeptical look. Heinrich walked up then and, pale-cheeked, reported, "Draco, Goyle, and Crabbe came at Neville, and Neville chased them back to the common room." John stared. "That's your even match?" Malfoy flushed. He grabbed the sword from the armor. Goyle, idiot that he is, ran too slow and nearly got cut. John's mind ticked over. Mass hostility? He hadn't expected that level of friction. Neville, normally honest and steady, had been pushed to swing a greatsword. Too bad Malfoy hadn't been the main target. The blow had been held back. If Neville was pulling out a greatsword and still holding back, then things were heating up. John said flatly, "When Neville pulls his wand on you, that'll be enough." Malfoy grimaced. It seemed unfair. Why did he have to be the one singled out? Today's sword nearly disfigured him and drew Pansy's cruel laughter. John clapped him on the shoulder. "Trust your strength. You'll be fine in a few days." In the Constellation Society, they divided labor cleanly. Isolation and strategy were for some, while Malfoy was responsible for drawing fire, enduring mockery, and absorbing hatred. Only one among them could do each task. Cedric dove again and surfaced after an hour. His bubblehead charm had worked. Heinrich, watching, thought of the waters of Durmstrang. "The Edgars graduated from Durmstrang," he said. "My uncles swam under their lake. My father always talked about it." John asked, watching the sun dip lower, "What were your father and uncle like?" Heinrich sat on a rock, the last light catching his features, and a faint nostalgia softened his voice. "My uncle was a natural metamorph magus. He'd sometimes transform into my grandfather and scare everyone. He left a wine cellar at home full of excellent vintages. My father was the opposite, bookish, scholarly. He drank tea more than wine. He devoted himself to research. If not for the Edgar name, he'd have been highly respected. I don't want to be like my father. I want to prove that the light Edgar followed can bring Edgar out into it. 2 generations of Dark Lords had tainted the Edgar name. The family had become a byword for madness and evil. People kept their distance, if only silently. John patted Heinrich's shoulder. That day will come, he said earnestly. You'll be proud of your choice. Heinrich's golden eyes shone with fanaticism and resolve as he nodded. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, the gleam leaving his eyes, and it was time to return to the castle. Chapter 215, Isolated Neville and a Threat. Longbottom, I hope you aren't going to keep your head down in my class. During Transfiguration, Professor McGonagall singled Neville out. They were practicing cross-species transfiguration, and Neville, lost in thought, simply bowed his head lower when called. Hermione, feeling a pang of sympathy, leaned over and whispered, Professor, Neville hasn't been himself lately. Professor McGonagall shot her a look. Granger, a bad mood is no excuse to turn a guinea fowl into a wooden mouse in my classroom. She was as strict as ever, keeping the students on their toes, but McGonagall had a soft heart beneath the stern exterior. She scolded Harry and Ron for their mock dueling before clearing her throat. Before we finish, a few announcements. The Christmas ball is approaching. It's a tradition connected to the Triwizard Tournament and a fine opportunity to interact with our foreign guests. The ball is open to fourth-year students and above, though you may invite a younger student if you wish. Lavender Brown giggled high and shrill. Parvati poked her and aimed a warning look to remind her McGonagall was still speaking. Parvati, too, had to stifle her laughter. Both girls were thinking of the same face. McGonagall, ignoring them, continued, You are required to wear dress robes. The ball will be on Christmas night at 8 in the Great Hall and will end at midnight. Hermione seemed a little distant, as if she were thinking of something else. Listen, the Christmas ball will give us a chance to, well, relax. At that, Harry's gaze flicked to the tight bun McGonagall always wore. For the professor, letting her hair down would have been a daring gesture. That does not mean we will relax our standards of behavior, McGonagall added, sweeping a stern look across the room. If any Gryffindor disgraces the school, I will be very displeased. The students, children of Western families and precocious in their own ways, didn't need much prompting. The girls especially were already whispering about which Durmstrang lads were the most muscular and which Beauxbatons boys were the most gentlemanly. Boys traded lists of who they thought prettiest. After class, Hermione noticed Neville's gloomy air and hurried after him. Neville, are you all right? She asked, worried. Neville forced a smile. I'm fine, Hermione. Really? Hermione sounded skeptical. Did something happen? I saw you and Malfoy the other day. Malfoy had bullied Neville in earlier years, but after Neville joined the Constellation Society, the two had made peace. Still, Hermione had seen Neville snatch a sword from an armor and chase after Malfoy the other day. Neville hesitated. Maybe I did something wrong, he said, bewildered. He had asked around, but people either ignored him or laughed. He couldn't understand it. He had been timid once, an easy target for Malfoy, but after joining the Constellation Society, and with John's help, he'd found confidence and a place to belong. Now everyone treated him with indifference. It gnawed at him. He could endure the dark days, but the warmth of companionship made the isolation sting all the more. Hermione reached out to comfort him, but Neville turned away and walked off, head bent. He accidentally bumped into a suit of armor and heard it mutter a curse about clumsy oafs. Christmas ball? John had heard about the ball too, but when Snape mentioned it, it sounded like a lecture on preserving disgusting slugs for a cauldron. The head of house seemed like a man who'd been single for a very long time. Daphne sat a little apart from John that day, whispering to Pansy about the ball. Malfoy couldn't resist teasing. John, who are you going to invite? I'm not a champion. I don't have to find a partner, John said, shaking his head. He wasn't planning to dance. He hardly ever did. The last time he had danced had been at his grandfather's house as a child, and even that was hazy. Malfoy tried to hide a reaction when Daphne glanced over at them. Pansy made a throat-slitting gesture toward him, and Malfoy swallowed. But it is a tradition that's only just been revived, he protested. Wouldn't it be a shame not to dance? John stroked his chin. Good point. Then, with sudden dry amusement, he asked, "Who will you invite?" Malfoy hesitated, thinking the obvious answer was Pansy. Astoria, he managed, voice shrinking. John's eyes widened. Astoria Greengrass? Aren't you supposed to invite Pansy? Weren't you jealous of her back in second year? Malfoy bristled. No, fine, yes, I liked her once, but she was using me, buying things and making me carry them. I suffered. He sounded half angry, half embarrassed. John listened, thoughtful. Astoria's only in second year now, he said finally. Then his gaze shifted with something like cool amusement. Malfoy flushed. Before Malfoy could explain, John added, By the way, you have 3 extra laps for training today. Malfoy nearly collapsed inwardly. It had been doubled only the day before. Now 3 more laps? That remark sapped his desire to continue the conversation about invitations. He looked up and saw Neville approaching. Instinctively, Malfoy put on his usual sneer, but Neville wasn't there for him. Walking up to John, Neville looked him in the eye and said, John, I need to speak with you. Malfoy couldn't help himself. Talk about what? How much your parents' hospital bills were? He taunted. John watched Neville clench his fists. He nodded once and rose, cool and indifferent, and walked out. Neville followed him quickly. Malfoy stood in the Great Hall, watching as 2 girls slid into the seat he'd left and trying to recover his composure. He began awkwardly. That, Daphne smiled and cut him off gently. You don't have to say it. I understand. Later, as Malfoy ran his extra laps, clutching his stomach from a breakfast of durian mango scrambled eggs, a breakfast he declared terrifying, Neville and John paused on the covered bridge. Neville, replaying the last few days in his mind, asked with a sliver of hope, John, did I do something wrong? No. John's head shook once, measured. Then he looked up, his expression hardening into something colder, almost disgusted. It's just that your dullness, the way you don't fit with the Constellation Society, has completely worn me out. Neville went pale. John stepped closer. His eyes glinted dangerously as he leaned in and whispered, You'd better leave quietly. Disappear from this school. Neville, I know your weakness. Neville's breath hitched, sweat beading his forehead. John's gaze hardened again, filled with scorn. Your parents, he said, voice flat. Do you really believe every comforting lie? Did you think I'd save them? Neville stared at him, aghast. John chuckled coldly and leaned even closer. I was only playing with you, but if you anger me, I won't mind making your parents disappear. There are Death Eaters out there, aren't there? No, you can't. Neville's voice cracked. I can, John said, expression unreadable. You don't know anything about me, Neville. I've never been a saint. The words drained the color from Neville. He gripped the railing to steady himself as John's footsteps faded away. For a long moment he stood there, the darkness gathering behind his eyes. No one would threaten his parents and get away with it. Not if he could help it. The cold in his chest hardened into resolve. Chapter 216, Kid Longbottom and Counterattack. Explode in silence, or die in silence. The old Neville might have shrunk back, but the Neville who had trained under John was not the same person anymore. In that instant, his hatred for John flared into something white-hot. John hadn't gone far. He watched from the shadows, waiting. He needed a good person to nudge Neville down the path he'd chosen, someone who could lead him out. Percy Weasley seemed the perfect candidate. Since discovering that his ostracism had more to do with John's dislike than with any failing of his own, Neville had been behaving oddly. Malfoy's jibes had no effect. Neville didn't lash out. But that silence hid something else, a quiet storm building behind his eyes. Chapter 192. Did I suppress him too harshly? Malfoy wondered, suddenly uneasy that he might have gone too far. John glanced at him, irritated. Didn't this man see Neville building up his anger in silence? Malfoy was deep in thought until the sight of Astoria caught his eye, and the worry slid away. John watched Malfoy go, then noticed Daphne standing nearby, hesitating. He tilted his head. Your sister just walked past, he said. Huh? Daphne's thoughtful expression made her look absent-minded, almost fragile. John sighed inwardly. Family ties could be complicated. With the Christmas ball a week away, Daphne was torn about whether to speak up. Before she could decide, Fleur floated over with all her usual grace and turned to John. John, would you honor me as my dance partner? Her glance slid toward Daphne, and she smiled in a way that was almost too deliberate. Daphne bristled. No way, she snapped. springing to her feet. Fleur arched a brow. You're not going to invite John, so why can't he accept my invitation? Fleur had assumed John would be Daphne's escort and hadn't even considered asking him herself. Now, with only days left till the ball and no sign of an invitation, as an older sister, she decided to intervene. As for the idea that John might ask Daphne, ridiculous. Fleur would sooner think he'd ask Heinrich. Everyone who paid attention in the Constellation Society could see Daphne's hopes, but John was blissfully blind to them. Daphne tried a flustered excuse. John's busy, right? To her surprise, John nodded. I'm sorry, Fleur. I have something to take care of that day. Fleur's face flickered with confusion. Daphne's heart leapt. You're not going? She asked, voice bright with sudden hope. Too bad John truly was busy. I'm sorry, he repeated, firm. Daphne's light went out. Fleur shrugged and let it go. Very well, then I'll invite someone else. After Fleur left, Malfoy returned, grinning, oblivious to the dampened mood. Seeing Daphne and John standing close, he asked, foolishly, Son, did you ask Daphne? Daphne shot him a look that could kill. At that moment, Astoria ran up. What dress should I wear? She asked. A pastry sailed past Malfoy's head. Neville had been waking from nightmares lately. He dreamt of intruders carrying his parents away, of shadowy figures telling him to leave the school. Voices had mocked him. If you don't go, your parents will disappear forever. No, don't! Neville had screamed in his sleep before coming awake. He looked around. He was still in the dormitory. "'S all right," mumbled Ron from the next bed. "Nothing," Neville said, but he couldn't go back to sleep. He slipped out of bed and stared at the heavy snow outside. The wind hissed through the cracks in the door like a ghost. He padded down to the common room. At that hour, it was dark and empty. The ball was the day after tomorrow, and Neville still hadn't asked anyone to dance. He sat on the sofa and tried to steady himself. The constellation badge he'd been reluctant to remove suddenly vibrated against his palm. For a moment, he hadn't realized he'd put it on. Bitterly, he touched it. A phantom message sprung from the badge. Percy. Neville read, stunned. Neville, I can't believe it. John's gone mad. He tapped out a frantic reply, and more messages poured in. John has left the school. Heinrich said he kept muttering about the hospital. Something about a disgrace, about changing it. To lock people where they can never be found. I'm following him, towards the Humping Willow. Oh no, he found me. Neville's heart hit his boots. The dream, the warnings. He stumbled to his feet without pulling on a coat and bolted from the common room. The shrieking shack smelled of damp and old things. John sat at a rickety table, 2 wands lying in front of him. Percy's last text, "Save me," had manifested into a pale, terrified man bound nearby. John's face was dangerous and strange. Do we really have to do this? Percy croaked. John shrugged, voice flat. The small kindnesses you extended to him, those were his lifeline, weren't they? Percy had been the one allowed a little warmth from the Constellation Society. Neville had clung to that, so the thought of John cutting it off was unbearable. Percy sighed as if resigned. Fine, I know I can't make you change your mind. He'd underestimated how far John would go. On a collapsed bed in the corner, Mr. and Mrs. Longbottom lay fast asleep, smuggled out of St. Torrel. Mungo's overnight by allies John had contacted, Tang Mi and Chang. Percy had brought a small bag of potions with him. Percy, we should be practical, John murmured. A red flash burst and knocked Percy senseless. John waited. Soon, a hidden mechanism in the Humping Willow triggered. The secret passage creaked open under Neville's weight. He slipped inside, rubbing his cheeks, feeling nauseous and furious. He'd put the anonymous wand he'd found into his waistband. He'd need it. Neville broke through the last barrier, and the door flew inward. John turned, feigning surprise. The ferocity and the pallor on his face were still too fresh to be mere acting. Percy lay where he'd fallen. John! Neville shouted, panic tearing his voice. Neville charged. For an instant, a flicker of something like fear crossed John's face, but it was only a second. He raised his wand and hit Neville with a banishing charm. Neville slammed into the wall with a hollow, breathless thud. Neville Longbottom, John said, cold and scornful. How dare you show yourself to me? Neville scrambled, enraged. Why did you? Attack Percy. He's our partner. Partner, John scoffed, as if the word tasted wrong. He's a subordinate. Do you actually imagine I regard the Constellation Society as friends? Laughable. He raised his wand, and a red bolt leapt out. Crucio! Neville screamed, eyes bloodshot, racked by the unforgivable curse. John's voice was a whisper threaded with malice. It's a tool to get what I want. You disgust me, Neville Longbottom. Pure blood, my foot. You're a mangy mutt, begging for scraps. He laughed as he broke down Neville's last defenses. Neville snarled back like an animal backed into a corner. At the foot of his vision, two blurred figures stirred on the bed. He focused on them, his throat closed. "Mom, Dad?" he managed. "Oh, look at that," John chortled. "The gift I prepared for you. You like it? You can only blame yourself, Neville. If you'd been willing to disappear, none of this would have happened." John sauntered forward, pleased with his triumph. Neville wanted to kill him. Then he saw the wand tucked carelessly at John's waist. A desperate, dangerous plan snapped into place. He measured the distance and with a furious roar, lunged. John was taken by surprise and sent sprawling. The wand at his hip was gone, suddenly in Neville's hand. He had the anger and the months of humiliation fueling him now. He craned his voice and forced the spell he'd practiced into being. Crucio! Before the searing red could blossom, John pivoted, one hand closing on Mr. Longbottom's. "Shared dream," he said. Chapter 193. As Crucio hit him, John's body convulsed. Pain washed the color from his face, and his mind magic kicked in. Not enough, he thought. He feigned raising his wand. Neville took the bait and cast Crucio again. John's body spasmed. His wand slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. His face was utterly drained of color, but his eyes still held a mocking spark. "It's you. It's all you," he mouthed. Neville teetered on the edge of madness, driving Crucio home again and again, as if to shove back every humiliation he'd endured. Even John couldn't help a muffled groan. The curse's power kept climbing. His bones felt like they were being gnawed, his heart stabbed as if by a knife. "Is that all, Neville? Is that everything you've got?" John taunted, letting the words bait Neville further. John's mind magic adjusted continuously, using words and the faintest provocations to unmoor Neville's reason. Neville, lost to fury, ignored the fact he was unleashing an unforgivable curse over and over, seemingly determined to torture John to death. John's consciousness blurred into raw sensation. He could no longer form words, only let out ragged, meaningless screams. Fortunately, a silencing charm had been laid down in advance. Otherwise, the sound would already have escaped the shrieking shack. Percy, roused from his daze, blinked into sight and saw Neville repeatedly hurled Crucio at John. He snapped fully awake and lunged to stop him. But then he saw John's pained, resolute expression, as if saying, "Don't let my effort be wasted." "Damn it," Percy hissed, digging his fingernails into his palms until blood welled between his fingers. He couldn't bring himself to stop Neville. Doing so would ruin everything John had risked. As Neville raised his wand for another strike, John's mind finally slumped toward unconsciousness. A thin thread of blood connected him, like a cord, to Mr. and Mrs. Longbottom. Guided by that bloodline, John's mind magic launched empathy. Around him, countless shattered fragments drifted like torn photographs in snow, memories belonging to Frank and Alice Longbottom, torn and scattered beyond easy repair. This is huge, John thought, rubbing his chest where the pain radiated. The Crucio kept driving through him. If he was to restore their memories, he would have to endure the curse until the work was done. He forced a bitter smile. He really might be tortured to death by Neville's Crucio. After all, he'd used Neville's parents as a lever. He picked up a fragment, a photo of Mr. Longbottom in school robes. He kept searching, piecing the debris together as best he could. He closed his eyes, and golden threads of mind magic sprang from his fingertips. With a flick of his hand, the threads drew fragments together and fused them. Using the bloodline made the work faster. Scenes reassembled, after scene, Mr. and Mrs. Longbottom's memories stitched back into place. Outside, exhausted, Neville watched the unconscious John with a look of bitter triumph. He muttered through clenched teeth, "John, you forced me into this." John's plan had always been to be remembered as a protector, rather than to let the Constellation Society see the truth about him. Neville felt a wash of sorrow. He could not imagine how terrible it would be if the Society learned John was using them. Better that John take the blame. He closed his eyes, steeling himself. "Expelliarmus," he whispered. A force blew Neville off his feet before he could finish the spell. He sat up in stunned confusion to see Percy, very much alive, pointing his wand at him. "Percy, weren't you dead?" Neville blurted, unable to reconcile what he'd seen. Percy, breathless and agitated, dug through his satchel and pulled out 2 small bottles labeled Longbottom. He tipped them over Mr. and Mrs. Longbottom. A faint glow rose from their forms. Neville stared numb as Percy moved like a man possessed, finally pouring the bottle labeled Wick onto John and begging, "Please, John, wake up." The glow around the Longbottoms brightened into a mist of light. Within it, scenes flashed by like a memory reel, their lives now rushing back. Neville staggered to his feet and rushed over. "Percy, this is—" Percy looked at the still figure of John and then at Neville, anger and exhaustion in his voice. "Didn't you see? John is healing your parents." "But he said he would make Mum and Dad disappear forever." The accusation hit the air like a blade. "That was to provoke you," Percy said. "We never hated you. We didn't have a choice if we wanted you to harden your heart." Neville sank down, staring at his hands in horror. "We targeted you, yes," Percy continued gently, "but your constellation badge was never taken from you." The badge gleamed on Neville's chest. Tears tracked down his face as he looked back and forth between his parents' glowing forms and the unmoving John. The truth landed on him like a blow. All of this had been done for him. Regret flooded him until he couldn't breathe. He hit the floor with his fist. Blood welled from his knuckles. "Don't," Percy said softly, stepping between Neville and further self-harm, holding him back. "Don't let John's work be for nothing." Neville collapsed to his knees. John, still straining against the crucio, kept working on the fragments. Then, as if answering Percy's presence, a rain of white light fell and the immediate burden eased. Percy's potion had taken hold. The fragments it touched floated upward, and when John gathered them, they healed themselves on contact. He snatched them up greedily, though the pain in his chest protested and his eyelids drooped. The crucio still pulsed through him. He bit his lip to stay conscious and pushed on. A rush of restorative power from the potion coursed through him, giving him strength. He worked faster. Fragments combined into larger patches of memory until a single, central image formed. A family portrait of 3, Frank and Alice Longbottom, and a baby in Alice's arms. Neville. Rain fell again, and the drops smoothed the seams between fragments. John cupped the rain in his palm and drew it out into a thin silver thread, stitching the gaps together like a needle and thread. 2/3 of the repair was done. More fragments fell, but these were darker, streaked with black. As John touched them, the madwoman's cackling echoed through the memories, images of Mr. A. Longbottom refusing, and the couple being tormented under crucio, played out. These were the Longbottom's torture at the hands of Death Eaters. John tried to piece them together, but felt an invisible force pushing him away. "No," he thought, and sharpened his mind magic, anchoring his body against the repulsion. He surged forward and mended each fragment even as the space around him shook. The force of the memory tried to deform him, to wrench his consciousness out, but he forced the final 10th into place. The instant the last piece clicked into position, the room detonated with blinding white light that swallowed him. Mr. and Mrs. Longbottom woke with a gasp, bewildered, their eyes clearing as they took in their surroundings. For a moment, they didn't know where they were. "Neville?" Mr. Longbottom asked. When he saw Neville, still young in the memory of that terrible night but present now, something in his daze snapped back. Memories of Neville visiting them every year rose up, and the fog of confusion fled. Chapter 194. His voice was cautious and soft, as if afraid that speaking louder would wake him and shatter a dream. Neville stared at them in disbelief. He had always imagined the day his parents might wake and call his name. Tears welled in his eyes. Mum, Dad. Mrs. Longbottom had come to as well. They rose from the collapsed bed. The hand that had been clinging to Mr. Longbottom's wrist loosened. The sight stopped Neville cold. "John!" Percy rushed forward, trying to rouse him. The Longbottoms looked down at John where he lay, and, through a blur of emotion, pictures of the young man filled their minds. "Is it him?" they asked one another. They exchanged a look. During their foggy stupor, they had heard a guiding voice, and the voice had been John's. Mrs. Longbottom's face tightened with worry. "What happened to him?" Neville's face had gone pale. "John healed you," he said, but something had been done to John. Mr. Longbottom couldn't say what, only that for them to be healed, His son and his friend must have expended themselves. The doctors had visited many times and been helpless. Even Dumbledore had been powerless. With John collapsed, the joy that should have filled the reunited family was tempered. Neville looked a lot like his father, but his manner and heart were his mother's. Mrs. Longbottom's tears were mingled with guilt for being unable to help. Percy was frantic, pulling potion bottles from his robes. His hands shook and one slipped, shattering on the floor. "Damn it! Damn it!" he swore, wildly unlike himself. He knelt, fumbling, gathering bottle after bottle. "John, wake up!" He forced down potion after potion, the ones John had left behind, foreseeing that something might go wrong. Even when the last bottle was empty, John did not stir. Percy's shoulders sagged and he sank to the floor, defeated. Neville could hold back no longer and broke into sobs. A mournful silence settled over the shrieking shack. Mr. Longbottom, calmer, gripped his wife's hand. "This is Hogwarts, right? We can ask Dumbledore for help." That suggestion kindled fresh hope, and Percy moved to summon aid. "Wait," a weak voice interrupted him. Percy froze, thinking he must be hallucinating. John had opened his eyes and said with effort, "Don't fetch Dumbledore, take me back." "John, you're awake," Neville cried, stumbling forward to grip John's shoulders. "It's all my fault. It's all my fault." "It's not your fault, Neville," John managed, smiling weakly. "We're friends, aren't we?" He turned to Percy and, gathering breath, said, "Percy, take the Longbottoms to Hogsmeade. Someone there will guide them away. Don't cause a scene." Percy's worry didn't vanish completely, but he nodded and escorted Frank and Alice Longbottom out, explaining what had happened as gently as he could. John didn't want Dumbledore to see him in this state. "Neville, take me to the Chamber of Secrets. Be careful." Neville nodded without hesitation and hoisted John onto his back. The tunnel under the Humping Willow was narrow. Neville bent double and made his way back toward the castle without raising an alarm. Once inside, he carried John into the chamber, lowering him gently onto the stone floor. "Go back," John said. Neville hesitated, unwilling to leave. John waved him off. "Don't make anyone suspicious." "I'll wait here," Neville insisted, but John shook his head. He couldn't afford to have the Gryffindors notice Neville missing. After much urging, Neville finally turned and left. The heavy door shut behind him. John sat up, leaning against the table. "Neville really went all out," he muttered. The pain in his body made him gasp. It wasn't a wound so much as a crushing weakness. He glanced at the silver ring on his right hand. The barb that had pierced his finger still stung, the pain pulsing along the connection. Thanks to that link, he had been able to drag himself out of the white light he had nearly been lost in. After checking himself, he frowned. This time he hadn't lost his soul, but he would be physically debilitated for a while. He tapped the arm of the chair, and it tipped back, shifting into a large, comfortable bed. Mind magic was subtle and terrifying. It could alter a person's habits and reactions without their awareness. As John lay back, memories crowded in, the Longbottom's torture, and a single name flashing across his mind, a mad Death Eater woman, Bellatrix Lestrange. That memory explained the Longbottom's condition. John, having been closest to them, had absorbed pieces of their memories. Barty had been tried. Among the accusations was the torture of Auror Frank Longbottom and his wife. Barty had protested, but old Barty wouldn't listen. Perhaps, John thought, this had been dismissed as the act of a wayward follower. "Who cares about him?" some might have said. John pressed his temples and sorted through the memories. The Lestranges were among the Sacred 28. This branch had dwindled and come to a bad end. The remaining relatives had been imprisoned in Azkaban. From Frank Longbottom's memory, John learned how fiercely loyal the Lestranges had been to Lord Voldemort. Even after Voldemort's fall, they would have risked everything to capture the Longbottoms and extract information about his whereabouts. John knew, or at least suspected, that Voldemort's return was a possibility. If those loyalists were freed, they would be trouble. Better, John decided, to strike first. "Once old Barty takes office, I'll have him order the execution of the Death Eaters," he said to himself, a hard glint crossing his face. He thought next of the Lestrange family's wealth. Some aristocratic families hid their fortunes at home, but more often it was kept in Gringotts. The Lestrange's accumulated riches sat there, gathering dust, wealth that could be put to better use. Even if they get out, how will they manage without money? John mused. That problem would be simple enough to solve. Pierce, the head of the Auror office, could arrange a visit to Azkaban in time. As plans formed, John still lay awake, enduring the after-effects of the link. He spent the rest of the night fighting the weakness. The next morning, the door to the Constellation Society's meeting room opened and people poured in. Daphne was first, nearly running. Heinrich followed, then Cedric and the others. John forced a smile despite his pallor. Tears stood in Daphne's eyes. She gripped his sleeve. "I'm not going to lose you," she said. Neville was there too. Daphne's gaze darted at him, fierce and still furious. John steadied himself as he rose. "Neville, you do realize your actions have consequences, right?" Neville trembled but met John's eyes. "John, whatever the price, I'm willing to pay." "Very good." John picked up the two wands Heinrich had retrieved and walked toward Neville. Neville had steeled himself to accept whatever came, even death, but under the watchful eyes of their friends, John placed the two wands into his hands. "Take good care of these," he said, patting Neville's shoulder. "That's it?" Neville breathed, incredulous. "John, I did something wrong." John chuckled. "Then your price is to clean the Constellation Society every month from now on." He said it lightly, and at the word friend, Neville's eyes reddened. He tried hard not to break down, shoulders shaking. The other members, seeing John was alive and reasonably well, flocked to Neville, patting him on the back. No one blamed him. As Malfoy passed, he couldn't resist a tease. "Neville, you're not crying, are you?" he said with a sneer that was half insult, half comfort. Neville turned his head, and voice barely above a whisper, said, "Thank you, everyone." Malfoy flashed a grin. "Did you forget what John said? The Constellation Society shares everything because we're friends." The mood lightened, and the group lingered, relieved. All day, John remained fragile and depleted. He was pale and moved slowly, drained of energy. The Weasley twins slipped in to check on him, squinting as if Heinrich the vampire might have bitten him. John rolled his eyes at their theatrics. "And John," one of them asked, grinning, "you haven't invited a dance partner yet?" Tomorrow was the Christmas ball, and Fleur had already come by earlier to ask the same thing. John only managed an exhausted half-smile in answer. John shook his head. Someone had asked him already. Both Parvati and Lavender had tried, but he had refused them. He had planned to spend Christmas in Dead Breath Valley, but that was delayed by the matter of treating Neville's parents. Once the Longbottoms had woken, their condition was steadily improving. Percy had brought word that the couple wanted Neville to attend the ball before they went to see him. They didn't want him to miss the Triwizard tradition. John had little appetite at lunch. Seeing this, Daphne appeared with a plate of pitaya fried rice she'd insisted she'd learned to make. His expression grew complicated, but when he saw how expectant she looked, he ate. Daphne had been trying so hard to learn to cook, he didn't want to dampen her spirits. Perhaps Daphne wanted to make every meal special. By the end of the meal, he finished the last grains of rice. Most students from fourth year up had stayed at school for the holidays, so the castle felt lively. John stretched. Heinrich was already a step ahead and offered a steadying hand. Daphne's fingers froze midair and she shot Heinrich an angry glare. "Sly man." John couldn't exercise in that mood. He went to the library and pulled out books on advanced magic. While treating Neville's parents, he'd ended up inventing a new charm. Different hearts, same dream. The spell demanded extraordinary talent and mental discipline. The caster could enter the depths of a person's mind through dream entry and plant a suggestion-like mark. As it germinated, that suggestion would subtly shift the target's behavior. It was more insidious than Imperio, not overt forced control, but gradual alteration. Creating such charms required vast knowledge. John sat with the books, thinking through how to refine the charm. Daphne found him in the library, but didn't disturb him. She settled nearby with her transfiguration homework. The quills scratching against parchment was soporific. The library was quiet. Aside from them, there were hardly any people. The sun slid toward evening, and it was time for dinner. John rose and waited at the door. Daphne hurried out with her homework, and when she saw him, she smiled. "Let's go together," he said. At the entrance to the great hall, he stopped and turned to her. Daphne, caught off guard, nearly bumped into him. She looked up. His brown eyes made her pulse quicken. Because of some things, I'll be attending tomorrow's ball, he said. Daphne's fingers toyed with a bookmark. Her heart leapt. She knew whatever partner John might have would not be her. Her expression dimmed without him noticing. He asked casually, Daphne, do you have a partner? No, she blurted before she thought. Blood rushed to her face, and she stared at him, bewildered. Then I invite you now. John stepped back with a small, formal bow, left hand behind his back, right hand extended. Miss Daphne, may I have the honor of your company? All Daphne's composure vanished. She reached out, fingertips brushing his. A tiny electric sensation ran through her palm and straight to her heart, sharpening every nerve. The pleasure is mine, John, she managed, smiling so that her ears flushed and her cheeks bloomed pink. John glanced left and right, then leaned closer with an embarrassed look. Actually, I can't dance. Could you teach me? His reasoning was simple. He couldn't dance, so he wanted someone who looked like they could. Greengrass girls were always graceful. Daphne would be perfect. Her smile brightened into genuine determination. I'll practice with you, she said. If Daphne had been holding a shield and a blue dress, John thought she'd look every inch the captain. They spent the night in intensive practice. John learned some basic steps. Daphne suffered a few missteps and a couple of painful treads on her toes, but she didn't complain. The ball was held as planned. Students arrived in formal dress. Malfoy cut a striking figure in a black velvet robe with a high collar. His platinum hair, parted in the middle, suited him perfectly. Astoria Greengrass wore a pale blue gown that caught the light. Heinrich had chosen a deep red suit and slicked his dark hair back. He looked unexpectedly handsome, though he stood without a companion. Percy was neatly turned out in navy, hair carefully combed like a second Old Barty. Daphne returned from their practice, changed quickly, and wore a white-fitted gown with a long train set with scattered gems that glittered like starlight. Her golden hair fell in silk waves down her back. She looked like a perfect pearl. John couldn't help the little flare of astonishment when she came up to him. You didn't keep me waiting long, he said, smiling. She still wore the faint blush of exertion. The dress Mrs. Greengrass had chosen was a touch more grand than Daphne was used to, but it suited her. John himself was simply elegant in a well-cut black suit that emphasized his tall, slim frame. He reached for her hand. Daphne had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but her heart still fluttered as she linked her arm through his. Heads turned as they walked into the hall. Astoria's eyes brightened. They sat, and soon the champions entered. First came Fleur, in a silver-gray satin robe that matched the sheen of her hair. She looked like a Beauxbatons princess. Her partner was Roger Davies, Ravenclaw's Quidditch captain. Cedric followed, handsome, careful, helping Cho Chang with a courtly attentiveness. Krum arrived in a bold red suit, northern and imposing. Hermione had been transformed. She wore a flowing, pale purple-blue gown with her brown hair swept up into an elegant bun. John stared. Is that Hermione? Where are her teeth? He muttered. Her prominent front teeth had been reduced by cosmetic spellwork, and the change made her unexpectedly dazzling. John couldn't quite place Hermione and Krum together, but the tableau was enchanting. He spotted Ron beside her, flustered. Beside Ron was Padma, Parvati's sister, whose beauty was clear, but Ron's attention was fixed on Hermione only, leaving Padma's expression strained. The last champion to enter was Harry. His broad, slightly awkward smile was all his own. Parvati joined him. She had tried to ask John previously and had been turned down, but when Harry invited her, she accepted. The 4 champions took their places before the high table. Dumbledore smiled, pleased. Old Barty had come, dressed more casually than usual. Madame Maxime and Karkaroff were present among the professors. Yet the most startling arrival was someone else entirely, a man wearing a silver mask. A collective gasp ran through the students. Johnny Silverhand stood there, an inscrutable figure. Where others couldn't see the exchange, John and Johnny Silverhand gave each other a slight nod, an acknowledgement only they shared. Johnny turned his masked face and, from the curve of his eyes, seemed to grin. Heinrich's expression darkened. This man had come in a way that unsettled him. Gin Ledesle, sly man. At the head table, Dumbledore and Old Barty were talking in low voices. "Where is Ludo?" Dumbledore asked, glancing about for Ludo Bagman, who was usually so boisterous. Old Barty's smile had lost some of its stiffness. Ludo has run into a bit of trouble recently and couldn't make it tonight, he said. Dumbledore looked slightly disappointed. A shame. The ball is so lively tonight. Old Barty's smile grew more enigmatic. Perhaps it's even livelier where he is, he said, meaning clear in his tone. Chapter 196. He had only recently learned that Ludo Bagman, what a son of a bitch, was actually trying to rig the competition. Old Barty was furious. He had worked and waited for years for this chance to influence the Minister of Magic. Now this kid was trying to make a mockery of everything. As soon as he heard, Old Barty brought in a professional. John, of course, knew Ludo wouldn't take advice, but he was counting on Old Barty to beg him for help so he would owe a favor. He had even arranged for the message to be passed through Percy. When Old Barty asked for his assistance, John politely invited Ludo to the Silver Hand office. Gin Lettisley, disguised as John, didn't hesitate to detain him in the Silver Hand Johnny Store garden. A ministry official being held like that ought to have caused an uproar, but the Auror office was already under John's influence, so no one investigated. Old Barty, eager to punish the rule-breaker, didn't tell the ministry either. With deception at every level, no one knew Ludo was being held. Ludo was kept for a day and a night, unable to escape. "I was wrong, Mr. Silver Hand," he muttered, his wand confiscated. His plump body slumped against the wall, one hand slapping weakly at the stone. He couldn't get free. Nearby, a patch of thriving flowers sent a chill down his spine. He remembered what Mr. Silver Hand had said during the first task, and he even saw an unfamiliar bone in the flower bed. He came close to breaking down. The Christmas ball was lively. Dumbledore thoughtfully made sure everyone ate their fill before the dancing began. John scanned the menu and felt as if someone was playing a joke on him. What on earth is fried Tianshan snow lotus? And salt and pepper scorpion heads? Stir-fried centipede legs in sauce? This rat-tail juice is going too far. I'm a virtuous young man. Blueberry ink fried noodles. Watermelon grape stewed glass noodles. Hominy melon blast. Ethnic style? This banquet was a buffet of sorts. You only had to name a dish, and it would appear on your plate. But John kept thinking the menu had been designed to torment him. He glanced at Daphne, who was shyly watching him. He didn't know the house elves had prepared that menu specifically for John Wick. There was only one, and it was their way of showing respect. It was based on recipes Daphne had kindly provided, with the house elves' own inventive additions. "A pineapple pizza, please. Thank you," he said quietly. He silently apologized to Italy in his heart, but he had to try. Some of these things seemed like attempts on his life. He finished the pizza, half expecting a scolding from the country. He refused everything else on the menu. Daphne, elegant as ever, cut a steak into bite-sized pieces and ate delicately. When she finished, Dumbledore stood and signaled everyone to rise. With a flick of his wand, the tables flew to the walls, leaving a wide-open space. He conjured a tall stage and instruments. While others marveled, John couldn't help but admire Dumbledore's transfiguration. Brilliant. The Weird Sisters took the stage. Despite the name, the band was all men, with thick hair and deliberately torn clothes, a rock look by Muggle standards, but their music was slow and melancholic. Fleur smiled as she led Roger Davies onto the dance floor. Roger was utterly smitten. He wouldn't hesitate to do anything for Fleur. Cedric offered his hand to Cho Chang, and they stepped out together, a pleasing blend of East and West grace. Krum asked Hermione to dance, and Hermione accepted. John thought he could smell jealousy. Oh, right, it was Ron. Padma Patil stepped in as well. She was as celebrated at Hogwarts as her sister Parvati. But Ron, who had apparently invited her, barely looked at her now. No respect at all. The King of Vinegar, as John silently dubbed him. Then Harry entered, looking especially uncomfortable. When Harry danced with Parvati, his face betrayed obvious misery. He stared at the ceiling as if it were the most fascinating thing in the room. Dancing with Parvati seemed like a cruelty to him. John was enjoying the show when Daphne stood. "John, shall we dance?" His smug expression froze. It was his turn. He smoothed his face into a polite smile and took Daphne's pale left hand in his. His mind filled with the steps he'd practiced all night. "It's our turn." He laughed softly and stepped onto the dance floor to the music, placing his hand on Daphne's waist. They moved through spins and bends, waist holds and half turns. Two figures, one in black, one in white, at the center of the floor. Malfoy had intended to ask Astoria to dance, but caught her watching the couple on the floor with rapt eyes. He was annoyed. Seeing Pansy standing nearby, he went over to her, just about to ask why she didn't have a partner. "Get lost, don't bother me," Pansy snapped. Malfoy was stunned and rubbed his side, watching Pansy and Astoria huddle together like they were about to grab a bowl of food and start fighting over it. "What's so special about this? It's not as good as watching merpeople fight," he muttered. Goyle shook his head at him and sighed. "Draco, you'll make people think you're an idiot." "You call me an idiot. Who are you to call me that?" Malfoy exploded. "If you're so tough, let's go outside and fight." He had been called stupid by Goyle, the same Goyle who failed exams. Outrageous. Goyle sneered, a chocolate bar clenched in his hand. "What good is being a good fighter? Out here, you need strength and connections. What street are you from?" "My name is Aid. If you don't like that, call me young master. I can handle it," Goyle drawled, baring his teeth. "Oh, so you're just a little nobody." Malfoy glared suspiciously, elbowed Crabbe, who had a small cake hidden in his pocket, and asked, "Is he not on our side?" Crabbe, mouthful of cake, mumbled, "I think he is." Meanwhile, the Weasley twins, having stuffed a box labeled Rampant Chocolate Bar into their pockets, slipped away to the side. Malfoy, temporarily cowed and embarrassed, snapped and began slamming his head into Goyle's repeatedly. The commotion grew so loud that Snape, patrolling and catching young couples, dragged them both away by the ears. "Draco, let me explain. I really didn't mean it," Goyle whined. "Shut up. Call me young master. I can handle it. You said a good fighter is useless. Take another one." Outside, the hall buzzed. After a dance, John felt his smile was about to lock into place. He put his arm around Daphne's slender waist to steady and lead her, but he pulled too close and drew her against his chest. Daphne jumped back as if she'd touched boiling water, separating quickly. The contact had been brief, but when John looked at her again, she was so red he worried she had a fever. "Are you all right? Do you want the hospital wing?" he asked, concerned. His concern only made Daphne more mortified. She covered her face and fled. John reached instinctively to stop her, but failed and stood bewildered. He patted his chest. He'd been bumped before and was still sore. He never realized Daphne's head was so hard. As he was about to go rest, Padma Patil walked up and offered a smile. "Would you like to dance with me?" The two candy-chewing boys in the corner nearly leapt up in outrage. How dare she try to steal their sister's dance? John glanced at Ron, who was still staring at Hermione and didn't even notice Padma leave. He sighed inwardly. He's doomed to be single, he thought. Chapter 221. Moody's Dance Moves and Warning. The headmasters and professors joined in too. John watched Dumbledore dance with Madame Maxime. Even with his pointed hat, Dumbledore barely reached her chin. Madame Maxime's movements were elegant, nothing like John's improvised steps. Even Mad-Eye Moody joined the dancing, twirling Professor Sinistra. What should have been a comic sight turned out surprisingly well. Moody controlled his wooden legs skillfully and looked respectable. Old Barty hesitated on the sidelines. He was used to appearing approachable, but dancing made him uncomfortable. Students kept streaming onto the floor. Neville seemed distracted, thinking of his parents, and Ginny had agreed to dance with him more out of pity than anything else. Chapter 197. The Weird Sisters finished one song and launched into another. Padma asked John to dance, but John, still smarting from Daphne's earlier bump, felt a dull ache in his chest and politely declined. He did it with such an easy grace that Padma barely reacted. A Beauxbatons boy soon asked her instead. John rubbed at his sternum. The air in the hall felt thick. Too much mind magic had been used tonight, and combined with the fatigue of dancing, every student's feelings flashed before his eyes like neon signs. He looked over at Dumbledore. The headmaster had separated from Madame Maxime. Hagrid, seizing the chance, had asked her to dance. Hagrid glowed with joy, but beneath it were nerves and bashfulness. Madame Maxime showed a small, lukewarm interest in return. Hagrid would have to keep trying. Dumbledore, of course, was unreadable. A clumency masked whatever was going on beneath that kindly face. Karkaroff was nowhere to be seen, likely slipped out. Moody sat apart after his dance, listening to the music and still cradling his hip flask. A faint, shallow pleasure showed through his defenses. Moody, too, used a clumency, which made sense for someone carrying that kind of history. Most of the others were straightforward. McGonagall was exuberant enough that she looked like she wanted to pull old Barty onto the floor herself. Out of the corner of his eye, John caught Heinrich looking impatient while the man with the silver mask was speaking to him, mischievous amusement plain on his face. Percy answered in his usual fastidious way, and Gin and Percy were arguing quietly about the new arrangement for tent entrances and exits, which left Heinrich awkwardly standing as if he were a waiter. John hoped no one was about to broker some earth-shattering bargain with him. Heaving a small sigh, John left the ball. No sooner had he stepped out than Ron and Harry sat at a nearby table. The two were brothers in misfortune. Harry's partner Parvati had tired of his standoffishness and drifted away with a Beauxbatons boy. Victor, Harry said, had gone to fetch drinks. Hermione came over while Crumb was at the refreshment table to check on her two sons. This provoked Ron into a string of sour, jealous comments. "Victor? Didn't he ask you to call him Vicky?" he sneered. Crumb's mangled pronunciation had made Hermione sound oddly affectionate to everyone else. Crabbe, chewing fruit, puckered his face at a tart apple as if it were an offense against nature. Ron continued his whining, insisting Crumb was only cozying up to Hermione to pry information out of her, maybe to trick her into opening the golden egg, and other equally imaginative accusations. Hermione, furious, ignored the two of them. She had neither invited Crumb nor deserved to have her motives questioned. Outside, the grounds were cold and quiet, dusted with a light layer of snow. John had hoped to escape the neon glow of emotions by stepping into the rose garden, but he underestimated how much of the school still pulsed with raw feeling. As he passed a rose bush, 3 deep creases formed on his forehead, his perspective flooded with ambiguous signals of longing and affection. He muttered, "Can't these young couples wait until after exams to fall in love?" He had barely finished the thought when a wave of fear rolled toward him. He followed it to its source and came upon a cornered scene he hadn't expected. Karkaroff's voice was hoarse, his words clipped and low as if he feared being overheard. "For months, he's been getting more obvious," he hissed. Severus Snape's response was impatient, the opposite of Karkaroff's panic. John tried to read Snape but ran into the limits of his skills, a clumency made Snape hard to pry open. He could only pick up what Snape chose to show, and even that was restrained. Karkaroff, frantic, blurted that he'd done terrible things in the past and would be the first to suffer if Voldemort truly returned. John, aligned with old Barty and aware of Karkaroff's betrayal history, let that explanation stand. Traitors were the ones Voldemort despised. John turned to leave and almost walked into Hagrid and Madame Maxime. The two cut an arresting figure on the path. When they tired, they sat on a stone bench. Hagrid was awkwardly shy, shrinking in a way John couldn't help but find endearing. Rita Skeeter hovered nearby like a bright, buzzing insect, eager, curious, hungry for scandal. John snorted inwardly. Through legitimacy, he knew Rita had been trying to dig up a sensational story, and Hagrid, bless him, was about as secretive as an open book. "I knew the moment I saw you," Rita was saying, all the small voice of a reporter about to sink a probe into private life. Madame Maxime bristled. "Knew what?" Hagrid blinked at her. "I knew that you're like me. Is it your father? Your mother?" Madame Maxime's frustration flared into anger. Rita's beetle shuddered with excitement. "Forget it," Rita smirked. "I do suspect Hagrid drank Veritaserum when he was a child." John heard Hagrid about to say something that would have ruined things and made a deliberate clearing sound loud enough for them all to notice. Hagrid turned his head instantly. John stepped out from behind the roses with an apologetic smile. "Excuse me, Hagrid, Madame Maxime, am I interrupting?" With an extra person present, Hagrid's courage dissolved. He had found bravado only when he and Madame Maxime were alone. In public, he reverted to that boyish shyness. John glanced at Rita, who was already sniffing for a story like a bright light draws moths. Everyone else wanted him to go away, but he stayed, smiling and gentle. "Madame Maxime," he said, "I just saw Fleur being led by a boy toward the rose bushes not far from here." That was all it took. Madame Maxime exploded up from the bench like a coiling storm. She moved with a sudden, magnificent fury and strode off at once, furious to find someone courting her protégé. Hagrid reached out to stop her and missed. He sat back down, crestfallen. Nearby, John detected irritation from Harry and Ron, angry they might have wrecked Hagrid's date. Let them be. John moved closer to Rita. As she shifted to transform her wand into a small beetle and crawl into Hagrid's earhole of gossip, John flicked the insect away with a practiced motion. Rita was sent spinning, dizzy for a few moments. John leaned toward Hagrid, who sat staring at the ground. "Some things are better left unsaid," he whispered. Hagrid looked bewildered. "What?" he asked in that big, honest voice. "What were you going to ask?" John pressed gently. "I just wanted to know which of her parents, was it her mother or father, who's a giant?" Hagrid said, wide-eyed and earnest. John rubbed his forehead and scolded him, half joking and half stern. "That's a private thing. You can't go around asking people that as soon as you meet them. You know how half-bloods get treated, like werewolves, even those who take potion face discrimination. Madame Maxime hates people talking about it. If you like her, don't ever bring it up." Hagrid's face went pale as he finally understood. "I didn't mean any harm," he stammered. He was grateful John had intervened. By then, the irritation from the earlier few had faded. Harry and Ron had clearly heard enough to know they'd misread the situation, and they slunk off. John watched Madame Maxime's retreating back until she disappeared into the crowd. The ball wound down at midnight and the Christmas holidays began. The castle emptied and settled into a quieter, slower rhythm, and John's days narrowed to one task: rest and heal. The after effects of all the mind magic had been worse than he'd anticipated. He sat alone one afternoon with tears running down his cheeks, feeling hollow. "This damn empathy is making me so melancholy," he muttered, wiping his face. Chapter 198, John cried at the drop of a hat, as if he had no control. The smallest surge of feeling sent tears streaming down his face. Fortunately, it was the holidays, and he didn't have to go out and face anyone. Only the members of the Constellation Society knew. Malfoy wanted to laugh, but dared not. He was barely holding it in. Daphne was radiant, all smiles. She delicately cut fruit into small pieces, picked one up with poise, and fed it to John. "Woo-woo, Daphne, you're so good to me." John hated his empathic ability. He was so touched that he threw himself at Daphne, hugged her, and dissolved into tears. Daphne patted his back like calming a child, her face lighting up with a warm smile. There, be good." Daphne's gentle comfort only made her brighter, her happiness infectious. Malfoy, amused, crept closer to see if he could provoke John. Sensing mischief, John immediately knocked him out cold with a blow that sent him into a childlike sleep. Fleur arrived at the Constellation Society to find Malfoy sprawled on the floor and John still clinging to Daphne and sobbing. She hesitated. Maybe I shouldn't have come, she thought. Cedric arrived soon after, both of them stunned by John's state. Trying to pull himself together, John watched them approach with red-rimmed eyes. Fleur, who had once joked about crying over wine and beauty, suddenly felt that the phrase, "I see him and pity him," applied to a man. "I've found a clue," she announced, trying not to look at the pitiable John. Cedric smiled helplessly. "I knew it too." Fleur's proud expression faltered. "Cedric was going to remind you. Really, with him like this, I could cry myself to death." John was already sobbing again. "This friendship is amazing." "Oh, don't cry," Fleur said, stepping forward to help. But Daphne shot her a warning look. After a flurry of flustered attempts, John finally steadied himself. He took deep breaths and, calmer, said, "Sorry, this is a side effect from overusing magic last time." "It'll pass in a few days," Heinrich answered quietly. He had returned and sat down without fanfare. John glanced at him. Heinrich gave a barely perceptible nod. "Fleur, have you decided on your method?" John asked, hands clasped under his chin. Fleur glanced toward Cedric. "I plan to use the bubblehead charm, but I'm not very practiced with it," she admitted. "It seems you and Cedric had the same idea," John observed. "You should also learn how to communicate with underwater creatures." They both blinked. John had reminded them something they'd overlooked. The treasure hunt included underwater creatures acting as NPCs. Realizing their omission, Fleur and Cedric left to prepare. After they departed, John lay back, drained. He had already begun brewing potions. He needed something like a sedative. By the time the second semester began, John had finally brought his powerful empathic ability under control. Daphne was unhappy about the change, which puzzled him. Owls poured into the great hall. One carried the Daily Prophet. John took the paper and saw a small article about Hagrid. Magizoologist, it read. John smiled. If Hagrid saw the title, he would laugh. Rita Skeeter's tenacity was obvious. She would have worked herself to the bone putting that together. The piece declared Hagrid a beloved teacher and Harry Potter's favorite professor, and praised his blast-ended scroot as a landmark in magical zoology. John rolled his eyes. Exaggerated. He turned the page to the Triwizard Tournament coverage. The Hogwarts area had been swept by a betting frenzy. Every witch and wizard, young and old, was placing sickles and galleons. The bets weren't huge individually, but they added up. Some wagers even came from abroad. If the trend continued, John calculated, the money could rival the World Cup. Crum's stellar showing in the World Cup combined with Harry's fame had pushed the tournament into the spotlight. The Daily Prophet's relentless publicity left no one unaware. The rankings had shifted. Crumb, once comfortably first, had fallen to third. Cedric was now second, and Harry had moved into first. If it weren't for Crumb's massive fan base, he'd probably be fourth by now, John mused. Fleur suffered from a lack of fame, and Cedric, despite top scores, was still overshadowed by Harry in the press. John wondered whether a firebolt could be used in the first task, or whether relying on a wand would be considered exploiting a loophole. The competition felt set up for the honest and straightforward to be at a disadvantage. A black owl dropped an envelope and flew off. John picked it up and opened it that night. The letter came from Silverhand Manor. His expression darkened as he read. Guards had been attacked, the assailants driven off, but the attackers had been able to find the manor. That meant they weren't simple amateurs. Could it be Lord Voldemort? John wondered. But if it had been Voldemort, they shouldn't have been driven away. Barty was imprisoned at Silverhand Manor, so it was likely Death Eaters had come knocking. They found him even though I cut off his dark mark? John thought. Not simple at all. He realized he had underestimated the remaining Death Eaters. After Voldemort's fall, most were captured and sent to Azkaban, but the elites, the Lestranges and others, remained dangerous, and some had escaped and were waiting for their chance. The fact that Death Eaters could locate Barty in the manor suggested a betrayal from inside. Silverhand Manor was enchanted. Only the security team should have access. The possibility of an insider set John's teeth on edge. He wrote to Tang Mi at once and asked for a thorough investigation. He did not want Tang Mi to go in person. He asked instead that Tang Mi find a trustworthy infiltrator to join the manor's security team. Tang Mi replied the next day, promising to clear the security team and saying he had already found someone superb at disguise to slip in. John sent him a ring as well. Warn, it could temporarily disable the restraints on Barty. Once removed, it would trigger the restraints John had set. Barty was quietly transferred to another prison. Ludo had been imprisoned for more than 10 days. Except for the single meal that appeared each day, he had no one to talk to, and the silence was driving him mad. One morning, he woke to find another person in the cell. Ludo was ecstatic. He recognized the face, though faintly. The newcomer leaned in close. Barty opened his eyes, saw the large face, and without hesitation threw a punch. Ludo, bewildered, punched back. The two traded blows. Ludo, despite missing a hand, fought ferociously, so fiercely that it left Barty backing away until, finally, Barty cowered in a corner like a frightened child. His eyes were dark and uncertain. He had no idea how he'd ended up there. Meanwhile, Rippy Caballero had already blended into the manor's security team. As an old Auror, Rippy's greatest strength wasn't magical power, but his uncanny ability to get along with anyone, an asset that would prove invaluable. Chapter 223, Prefect's Bathroom and Underwater Treasure. At night, Harry slipped out of bed, drew his invisibility cloak around himself, and crept from the dormitory. To be extra careful, he took the Marauder's map. Once he had everything he needed, he eased the portrait-studded door open and stepped into the corridor. Cedric had told him at the Yule Ball to try the prefect's bathroom. At first, Harry had assumed Cedric was just showing off his prefect privileges, but after getting nowhere with the golden egg, he decided to see for himself. Hogwarts was eerily quiet because of Filch, so Harry moved cautiously, checking the map from time to time. He flinched when he saw Filch sprinting across the map as if propelled by magic. One moment the caretaker was on the second floor, the next he was on the third. Finally, Harry reached the door to the prefect's bathroom. He whispered the password, "Fresh pineapple." The door creaked open. Harry's heart thudded. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him. On the map, he watched Filch race past the doorway and felt the sweat go out of his palms. He pulled off the invisibility cloak. The bathroom was astonishing, a vast rectangular pool ringed with about 100 golden taps. Harry had to admit being a prefect had its perks. The place alone would make anyone jealous. He wandered the edge, turning on a few faucets. Each released a different fragrant, bubbling stream. He couldn't see how this room could possibly help with the golden egg, but it was too luxurious not to enjoy. He stripped and waded into the water. It was deep enough that his feet barely touched bottom. He swam a couple of lengths, came back to the edge, and picked up the golden egg to examine it. Still no clue. When he tried to pry it open, the egg screamed, a piercing, unnatural shriek that nearly made him lose his footing. He slammed it shut and froze, terrified of drawing Filch's attention. Then he felt eyes on him. "Myrtle?" he said, startled as the ghost drifted through the pipes. "I thought it was that handsome lad," she said, sounding disappointed. She floated closer, inspected the sight of Harry standing there stark naked, and replied with a sulk and a blush. "John is still better looking," she added after a long, lingering glance. Before Harry could argue, she said lazily, "That handsome chap dropped the golden egg into the water," and, without waiting for him to ask more, sank back into the pipes and disappeared. Harry sat there thinking. He set the egg in the bath and soaked until his skin was pale. Finally, remembering he hadn't actually opened the egg, he plunged his hands in and pried it open again. The brutal scream he'd heard turned astonishingly into a beautiful song. The second task clicked into place. He finally understood. The clue pointed to something in the water. Quickly he dressed, shrugged the cloak back over his shoulders, and slipped for the door. On the map, Filch was racing back toward the bathroom. "Oh no," Harry whispered, and altered his route. But Filch moved faster than he could, and before Harry reached the staircase, Filch was nearby, sniffing for footprints. Harry held his breath. Then a rough voice barked, and a new figure loomed into view. Moody's ugly face peered around the corner, and Filch, fawning, straightened. "Professor," Filch croaked. Moody's magical eye swung, finally landing on Harry. "Someone was running very fast a moment ago. I lost him." Filch, offended at the idea of being thwarted, lunged in the direction Moody indicated, giving Harry the chance to slip away. Moody did not leave immediately, however. He studied Harry and then, without looking directly at him, addressed him with an odd mixture of surprise and sternness. "You must have had a good reason," he beckoned, and Harry handed over the Marauder's map. Moody inspected it with a delighted glint. "This is a valuable thing. Mind if I borrow it? I need to be careful of those troublemakers who like to sneak into the school," he added with a hint of mystery. Harry found it strange, but Moody had been unusually helpful lately. He'd even offered advice about the first task, so Harry didn't press it. Moody tucked the map away, watching Harry's blip move across it for a moment longer. "Very useful," he murmured, then turned and walked off in a different direction. Time moved fast, and before Harry knew it, the day of the second task had come. John's tendency to cry easily had mostly improved, though he still had a strong capacity for empathy that could catch him unawares. That made for an especially sentimental Valentine's week. Daphne was in a wonderfully good mood for days. John was no longer wearing a mask. He saw Heinrich being dragged into position by Chang, Heinrich in a silver mask, Chang in white, and Chang was whispering something teasing in Heinrich's ear while Heinrich kept a poker face. John, watching, half laughed and muttered, "Don't ruin my image." When, John wondered, had Johnny Silverhand ever had someone whispering silly things in his ear? Everyone knew the second task would be in the Black Lake. The 4 champions had already learned that much. Ludo Bagman had been released but looked gaunt. His cheeks Humbledore teased him about being on a diet, and Ludo insisted he was. He seemed too afraid to overindulge after Tang Mi reported that Barty had thrashed Ludo 9 times in 3 days. There were also developments about the mole in the security unit. They'd narrowed suspicion to an embedded dark wizard on the Silver Hand Manor patrol. Tangmi's friend Rippy had managed to befriend the man, though both were cautious. Fortunately, both liked to smoke. "Just string him along," Tangmi advised. "When he contacts the Death Eaters, we'll take control." John was eager to bait them into a trap. Silver Hand Manor had quietly become a giant snare. He planned to catch that group of Death Eaters once they made a move. The competition was about to begin. Harry arrived at the shore of the Black Lake just in time. Karkaroff looked disappointed. He had probably assumed Harry would be late and thus disqualified. Ludo's heart leaped with relief, though he tried to hide it. After all, he'd bet his fortune on Harry winning. John glanced at Harry, curious how he would manage to breathe underwater. Then the whistle blew, and Harry popped something into his mouth. "Gillyweed," John blurted, surprised. Where had Harry gotten it? Gillyweed was rare, and Harry hadn't been able to procure it by normal means. He hadn't even used Axio. He'd simply brought it and eaten it. As the crowd watched, Harry's neck split with the appearance of gills and webbing spread between his fingers. His feet lengthened and webbed as well. He resembled a merperson. He plunged into the black water, and relief flooded him when he discovered he could breathe easily. The lake was murky. Visibility was barely 10 feet, which made the task of finding anything under the surface all the harder. Dobby had told him when he gave Harry the gillyweed that Ron was being kept like a treasure at the bottom of the lake. The song's hint made it clear the champions had an hour to find their own loved one, or that person would be lost forever. Panic and urgency tightened Harry's chest. He had to find Ron quickly. Beneath the surface, a jungle of long, swaying waterweeds closed around him. The deeper he went, the denser it became, and for a while he lost his sense of direction in the darkness. Then something snagged his ankle. He turned and felt slimy strands wrapping around his leg. He fumbled at them, trying to wrench himself free. A dark shape flashed past among the weeds. He spun to see what it might be, but could make nothing out in the blackness. The next instant, something grabbed him hard. He was yanked and dragged into the tangles. Hands and claws, or the grips of some many-limbed creatures, clutched at him, pulling him down, layer upon layer. He fought with everything he had. Chapter 224, Underwater Turmoil and the Lake Divided by Manpower. John didn't quite understand the second task. It wasn't like the first task, which could be watched live. A crowd stood around the pitch-black lake, unable to see anything. Their silence made them look foolish. Wizards thought in strange ways. John saw several students acting like live broadcasters, frantically trying to figure out how to spot someone in the water, as if they had gone down themselves. The lively atmosphere slowly quieted. John could only conclude that this task had terrible spectator appeal. Minutes crawled by before a tiny bubble finally rose to the surface. It was so small that only John's sharp eyes caught it. "Someone's coming up." At his words, others noticed too. Excitement rippled through the crowd. Everyone wanted to see who would surface first. Students from the 3 schools watched eagerly, hoping it would be one of their own. Under that scrutiny, a head broke the black water. Silver hair fanned around it. The girl's face was much paler from prolonged submersion. She was Fleur Delacour. Fleur looked ill. She swam toward the shore but hadn't rescued anyone. "Something attacked me in the water. It popped my bubble," she managed. She staggered as she reached the bank and nearly fell. John saw scratches across her body. Something had clearly grabbed her. She coughed violently, water streaming from her nose and throat. The corners of her eyes reddened from the effort. A Beauxbatons student rushed forward with a towel. John stripped off his wizard's robe and wrapped it around her. Tears welled in Fleur's eyes. She grabbed John's hand and said anxiously, "Gabrielle is still down there. The mer people attacked me." John's face darkened. He looked up at Dumbledore. Dumbledore heard Fleur, and a flicker of confusion crossed his face. He had tried to communicate with the creatures in the Black Lake before. They wouldn't help the champions, but they shouldn't attack them either. "If the bubblehead charm is torn, a champion can drown," John said in a low voice. "This is an attempt to kill the champions." Those around him breathed aloud. Even the students felt the chill of the implication. Dumbledore understood the gravity immediately. He called out in merperson speech, his voice taking on a higher tone. He was summoning them, but the merpeople did not respond. Things were slipping out of control. Dumbledore's expression hardened. He drew several judges aside to discuss the situation. He intended to pause the task and investigate. Karkaroff refused outright. Krum had not emerged yet, and Beauxbatons was already eliminated. The stalemate held. Bubbles began rising again from the lake's depths. Another head emerged, Cedric. He had Cho Chang with him, but his expression was grim. The merpeople have gone mad, and there are Grindylows. They're hunting the champions in the water, he said. Cedric, his hair tangled with weeds, explained, I hid in the plants and waited for the right moment to get her out. His words spread alarm through the students. Cedric came over to John and added more terrifying news. When I got there, that group of merpeople looked like they intended to kill the hostages. He described what he'd seen. Harry had been dragged by hands and barely managed to resist. As Harry was pulled from the weeds, he finally saw what was attacking. Grindylows, armed and trying to drown people. Harry managed to seize his wand and attack. The creatures shattered at the touch of his spells, shrieking and scattering. After a struggle, he reached a merpeople village, where a crude statue of a large merperson stood in the center of the square. 3 people were tied to its tail, Ron, Hermione, and a small silver-haired girl, Gabrielle Delacour, the same little girl John had noticed in his tent during the World Cup. They seemed half asleep, bubbles rising from their mouths. Harry tried to cut their ropes with a sharp stone, but just then, the merpeople shifted. A shark-headed creature surged forward. The shark was Krum transformed. The merpeople grabbed their tridents and drove Krum back. Harry freed the hostages, but the merpeople turned on them, spearing at the prisoners and attacking. Krum, bitten and speared, fought desperately, but was driven away. Harry kept fighting with his wand. An hour passed with no third champion surfacing. Karkaroff still refused to allow any pause. He insisted Krum could finish the task. Cedric warned that the merpeople had planned to kill the hostages at a certain point. This was not a joke. If Cedric had not acted quickly and cleverly, he might have been eliminated like Fleur. Fleur, she who had surfaced first, heard Cedric's words and wept, begging Madame Maxime to save Gabrielle. But the judges had to be impartial. So long as Karkaroff refused, no one could call the task off. John drew a deep breath. If the judges wouldn't intervene, he would. Cedric, which way? John asked in a steady voice. Cedric pointed to the merpeople village. John stepped to the shore and made a grasping motion in the air. A silver-bladed longsword formed in his right hand. Make way, he said. People cleared a path. Malfoy was the first to shout and shove the crowd aside. Dumbledore's protest died on his lips as everyone watched John with bewilderment. John stepped into the water, closed his eyes, and poured his magic outward. The ring on his right hand flowed with a steady stream of power into the silver blade. Holding the sword high, he intoned strange syllables. Spirit of the Black Lake, guide me. This sword shall cleave all that stands in the way and dispel evil. He opened his left palm, and a fist-sized ball of lake water descended into it. The water did not fall away but adhered to the sword like a transparent sheath, ancient magic binding to the blade. John commanded aquatic elements and had some manner of rapport with the lake. He had sought and, it seemed, received its permission. With the water-encased sword in both hands, he prepared his strike. Karkaroff shouted at Dumbledore, incredulous. What is he doing, Dumbledore? Is this your intention? Madame Maxime had no idea either. Fleur leaned on her and said, The merpeople went mad in the water. John is going to save them. Save them? Madame Maxime echoed, confused. Dumbledore's eyes held a strange light now. He, too, wanted to see what John would do. John finished the incantation. His eyes opened, and for a moment they were like a dragon's, radiating a pressure that made his hair shift, though there was no wind. His hands tightened on the hilt. Cleave through thorns. The cutting spell he had crafted suffused the sword. Runes shimmered along the blade. John swung. The sword cut through the surface of the Black Lake. An invisible trail fanned out from the blade toward the center, parting the water. The lake split. Water on either side separated like jelly, the split advancing so fast that onlookers watched as the vast Black Lake was literally cut in half. In the middle, a merperson village stood revealed. The scene left everyone stunned. The man standing in the parted lake looked like a sea god descended. He had cleaved the water and, by force of will, divided the lake. Chapter 225, Search and Rescue. In the exposed Merperson village, creatures lost footing and tumbled into the clinging mud. Crumb, whose ankle had been speared, shifted back into human form. Blood ran from his foot. Harry stood bewildered. With the lake water held aside, the charm binding the three hostages lifted, and they awoke. "My goodness, what happened?" Ron said, staring in disbelief. Gabrielle and Hermione coughed up water, equally confused. A pressurized hush fell. The merpeople, who had been ready to fight, shrieked and scrambled toward the water walls at either side. "Gabrielle!" Fleur screamed. When she looked up, the parted lake rose like a cliff, the walls of water towering around the exposed village.